St. Paul is in shock tonight after a student was killed in a stabbing at Harding High School. Sadly, Harding is no stranger to violence.
Stabbing happened Friday. It was in the hallway of Harding High School. Devin Scott died at the hospital.
In February, Devin Scott was stabbed to death at Harding High School in St. Paul. He was stabbed in the stomach and once in the chest. Devin was 15. It was his first day at Harding High. He'd just been transferred from another St. Paul high school. Now one kid is dead, another is facing murder charges. Devin was a troubled kid. Sources say he was involved in gangs and drugs. He had a history of problems in the public schools. A generation ago, a kid like Devin Scott never would have been in school. He would have been expelled before he ever got to Harding High. So how did he end up there? Devin's death is a visible symptom of the decay in public schools. From Moose Lake to Farmington, public education in Minnesota is broken. What was once one of the most trusted institutions in the state is now treacherous. Violence in schools is functioning much like COVID. When the pandemic hit in 2020, suddenly parents all over the country were in their kids' classrooms as they were taught on Zoom. Some educators are blaming COVID for learning losses,
calling it the COVID slide, kids falling behind in their academic progress because of the pandemic. Now, we can see this clearly in the data. McKinsey's study shows that already students have lost an average of 6.8 months of learning so far.
COVID didn't cause learning loss. It exposed it. It yanked back the curtain on what is going on in classrooms across the state, much like what violence is doing now. With more and more reports about school violence, parents are taking a closer look at what's going on when their kids are sucked up into the vortex of public schools. I'm Sheila Qualls. I write for a Minnesota-based news outlet called Alpha News. I've written a series of articles on ideologies, policies, and practices that allow violence, misconduct, and low performance to go unchecked. For the past 6 months, we've been examining public education. I've interviewed teachers, parents, and students. I've talked to people who study education in Minnesota. I've looked at curriculum and school websites. I've contacted the Department of Education, the Minnesota School Board Association, the Teachers Union, and administrators. I'm going to paint a picture of what is going on in our schools and why. Not in my words, but in the words of teachers, students, and parents who are in or around public schools every day. Thousands of Minnesota families are trapped, held hostage by a system that is shaped by misguided and irresponsible policies and practices that are at odds with traditional values. The threat of losing our children is real. Most teachers and parents spoke with us on the promise of anonymity. Small details have been changed to protect students' identities. They fear retaliation. Dissent is not tolerated. Disagreement is voiced only in whispers. Throughout this series, I'm going to show you everything from why kids can't read to why they have to worry about getting stabbed at school. This is Trapped: Chaos in the Classroom. There's chaos in Minnesota public schools. Chaos that administrators don't report, teachers and staff are afraid to talk about, and parents don't know about. The murder at St. Paul's Harding High didn't happen in a vacuum. Violence and low academic performance are rampant in schools across the state.
I would see on kids' Snapchat stories children just brawling in the middle of the hallways, punching each other over and over, teachers standing there watching, and teachers too afraid to stop it.
Why now? It hasn't always been this way. Kids are not learning the skills they need to become functioning adults because the focus of our schools is not education. What's happening in public schools looks a lot like education, but it's not. Schools are failing kids, but the education establishment continues to lower expectations. Accountability has disappeared. This creates conditions ripe for poor performance and disrespect. And that's exactly what's happening. Kids swear at teachers, refuse to turn in assignments, text during class time, play games on their phones, hold conversations while teachers are talking, and then dare them to discipline. Families are taking note, and some of them are taking action. Minnesota Department of Education reports public school enrollment has declined for a third consecutive year.
I don't know. I don't have an answer. You would think data like that would force us to shift back.
Reading, math, and science scores are in a free fall and show no signs of improving.
It's really hard to be an older teacher today. We see our numbers of our kids' math scores and our kids' reading scores and science scores aren't even on par. And Minnesota had one of the biggest drops, I think, in the entire country, when we used to be the marquee of what people strove for in education, right? And now we had one of the biggest drops.
Are kids getting dumber? Quite the opposite. Kids are as intelligent and inquisitive as they've always been. Public school is not what it used to be.
Things have changed so dramatically, so quickly. It's a crazy time. I mean, I could tell you story after story.
Officer Mark Ross is president of the St. Paul Police Federation. He is also a former school resource officer, or SRO. He grew up in St. Paul and graduated from St. Paul Public Schools. He said schools are failing in more ways than one.
I was an SRO from 2010 to 2014, and fortunately, I was in a great building, a lot of really good teachers that would actually help me break up fights, and it was required. I mean, let's be honest, these are kids, and part of being an adult is intervening when kids are doing things they should not be doing. And so when you have people in the building willing and capable of intervening when there's a physical fight, I mean, I think that's something that should happen. I could tell you that if my student was in a fight and there was, somebody, a school staff member who's capable of at least attempting to break it up, they didn't break it up, I mean, I would take exception to that. Not intervening in those situations. It can get really dangerous really fast.
I've heard stories from parents in Burnsville, Moose Lake, Delano, Farmington, South Washington County, Sartell, Isanti, and many more. Not just one, but dozens of stories from angry, frustrated parents all over the state who are not quite sure of what to do.
But the reality is, from a safety perspective, they just have to know that these kids are, generally speaking, not being dealt with. I mean, there are a lot of dangerous kids in these schools. They're engaged in criminal behavior on a regular basis. They're not being held accountable for the behavior, and the behavior is being allowed to continue. And so that makes for a very dangerous experience for people that don't even know they're in danger. And that's really the sad part. I mean, it was amazing to me how oblivious a lot of the students were to, I mean, obviously when a fight occurs, you see that. And I don't even know how prevalent physical fighting is in the schools now, because I don't think they're reporting it very often. And I can't tell you how many times over the last several years parents have called and said, my student was assaulted in school today and nobody called the police. They got home and told me the story, and now I'm calling the police. There's no way I would send one of my children to one of those schools.
Most problems are not as visible as violence. They're much less obvious and emerge over time. But issues have been quietly brewing beneath the surface for decades.
And it's like, you want to jump into something, you might get shot and killed. I mean, it's that crazy. Shooting each other is not normal.
In some high schools, kids don't go to class and rove the hallways instead. Teachers and students are afraid to go to the bathroom while class is in session.
Recently, I talked to a teacher that said that for over a year she didn't feel safe going to school. She felt safer in her room with the door shut. She said to me that I wouldn't want to even go to the bathroom because I knew that there were going to be students out in the hallways that weren't supposed to be doing the stuff that they were doing.
Fights are common in the lunchroom. Some parents report kids threaten to murder other kids. Instead of expulsion, violent kids now get administratively transferred. It's like a bad game of musical chairs. Violent kids rotate from school to school until they eventually graduate or just stop going. That's how Devin ended up at Harding High. Ross said there's no control in the high schools, and what happened at Harding was predictable.
But those administrative transfers are the root of the problem.
So administrative transfer really means a bad kid.
Typically, or kid that hasn't been able to function at another school. What they'll do is they'll say, okay, things aren't working. They're not working for you here anymore. We're going to transfer you over to another high school. Well, that creates another problem because for every kid you transfer out on administrative transfer, you get one back in. So it's like this game of musical chairs. These kids go from school to school to school, and they don't function at any of them. And the problem is all these kids know one another, especially the kids that are in the mix, whether it be they're in a gang or somewhere from a neighborhood or another neighborhood, or they have relatives at another school, but everyone knows everyone, whether it's a gang issue or something on social media. And I can tell you there were times at Como Park High School, when I was a school resource officer, where we'd get to a point where we finally got a couple kids that were creating tons of problems for us out. And the next week, we get two new kids in that were just as bad or worse because of the way that they administratively transfer kids.
Violence has surged since school boards removed cops from schools. After the death of George Floyd, they said the presence of a gun and a badge made some kids uneasy.
I used to keep my car parked in the front of Como Park High School, right in the front main entrance. That was where I parked my car. At the time, Superintendent Valeria Silva came one day and said, "Why is your car parked there?" I'm like, "Well, I have a lot of equipment in there and I need to have access to it if there's an emergency, and I don't want to have to walk, 3 blocks to a parking lot." And to be honest, it's a deterrent to crime. People see the squad car, they're less likely to commit a crime here. And a lot of people in the community tell me that makes them feel really safe. She goes, "Well, I'm hearing just the opposite. I'm hearing that it makes people feel uncomfortable." I said, "That's not true." I said, "Can you find me?" And this is me, a police officer. At the time, I'm not in a management role in the police department. I'm just the lowly school resource officer, as these administrators would view it. And so I pushed back on the superintendent of the schools, and she was pissed that I would push back on her.
Some kids may feel uneasy about police presence, but many more are uneasy about the lack of discipline and accountability. Those students are paying the price for bad policy.
Rather than actually put some meaningful work forward and try and change those things, they changed the way that they dealt with discipline. So they would allow the same behaviors. Previously, those behaviors would result in discipline, but no longer. So they would say, look at this. We've had this massive reduction in suspensions and dismissals and arrests, and we're doing so great. In fact, they actually tied building principals' bonuses to those numbers. So those folks that were dismissing, suspending the least amount of students were being rewarded financially. So, through a financial incentive, they actually kind of started to create this. But we're at a point now where there's just no control in the high schools. And they have kids wandering the halls, we'll say disrespectful things if anyone tries to hold them accountable. They just basically do what they want to do all day long and don't contribute at all to the well-being of the culture of the school and actually detract from it.
Kids used to take books and gym bags to school. Now, an increasing number of them take weapons, and administrators find some, but not all of them. Kids, faculty, and staff are no longer safe.
I would hate to even know how many guns are in the schools on any given day.
So do you obviously think there are quite a few?
Yeah, it's impossible to know the number, but I know they recover a few guns every year. Those are just the guns that are recovered, whether it be a lot of times it's a tip from another student or maybe something that's posted on social media. But those are just the ones that are recovered. So if a kid brings a gun to school in a backpack, how would you even know?
In January, a 15-year-old kid was arrested with a gun at Harding, where administrators had found at least 3 guns the year before. Harding isn't the only St. Paul school dealing with violence. A kid was seriously wounded in a shooting outside a rec center near Central High. And a bullet grazed a staff member's ear during an after-school shooting at a St. Paul magnet school. Ross said his children would have been 4th-generation graduates from St. Paul Public Schools. He moved his family because he does not want his kids in the district.
Yeah, it's sad. I'm saddened by what's happened in the St. Paul Public Schools. It's heartbreaking to me. Like I said, I was the 3rd generation from my family to graduate from St. Paul Public High School, and unfortunately, we weren't able to continue that tradition in my family, but we started a new, better tradition, I think.
Ready and going.
Can you tell me your name and which school you go to?
My name is Anthony, and I go to White Bear Lake North Campus.
And what grade are you in?
I'm in 9th grade. I'm a freshman.
This is Anthony. He's a freshman at White Bear Lake North Campus. Anthony's a B student. He likes baseball and is kind to his little sister. I spoke with Anthony and his mom, Ann, at their home.
It was just a big shock, and I feel like everyone in ninth grade now can say that high school is nothing like they tell us it's going to be, because they prepare us for things that don't actually happen or are going to happen.
So what do they prepare you for that didn't happen?
Well, they prepare us for things just like the atmosphere and the teachers and like the grading in the school and just like how everything is going to be and just like how high school sets you up for the rest of your life and college and things like that. But really what they should have been preparing us for is just the atmosphere of the students and how the students all treat each other and the things that go on there that you just see and that they just tell you to not look at.
So what types of things do you see that they would say don't look at?
We see fights pretty frequently, 2 to 3 a week, I'd say. And every time we ask something about them, they just say it's being handled, and to just blind eye look away from it and act like it never happened. And I don't think that's good, and I feel like we should definitely talk about it, definitely speak on it, because we can't just ignore someone getting punched in the face on the ground at noon at high school. I just don't think that's not how things should be handled.
When Ann learned Anthony was being assaulted by another student on the school bus, she contacted the school.
It started about last winter. My boys rode a bus to and from school together, and my younger son said, Anthony got hit on the bus today. I didn't think too much about it because Anthony is a kid to stand up for himself and he would have told me. And then it happened again and he said, Anthony got hit again today with a belt. So I told Anthony, I said, well, you need to go tell the office. He's an 8th grader. So I said, you need to tell the school, it's time for you to talk to the school. So he said he repeatedly would get off the bus, go into the office at the school and tell them, hey, there's an issue on the bus. I need to talk to somebody. And they'd say, oh, hurry on to class. And they wouldn't even listen. Hurry on to class. He said it went on for a whole week. He'd get hit with a belt on the bus. He'd go into the school and tell them. And they just would say, oh, hurry on to class.
White Bear Lake administrators told Ann they were handling it.
So I sent an email to the principal after a week. And she responded and said she would take care of it. But then I didn't hear any follow-up. So I asked for a follow-up. And the boy was never removed from the bus. I then followed up myself and called the principal and said, I would like to know that he was disciplined. I would like him off the bus. I would like him not near my boys. And then she told me she couldn't talk about another kid's discipline with me. So I never got any follow-up. I don't know where it went with this boy, but he never was removed from the bus or the classroom.
Like many parents, Ann is frustrated.
As a mom, it makes me feel pretty helpless. Because at first I told him, you're going to be in high school next year. You can stand up for yourself. You can report this to the office. And then the fact that I then had to go and report it and it still went on dead ears, it made me as a mom feel very helpless. They have to be in school every day. They have to ride the bus to get there. And I couldn't protect him. Anthony
is frustrated too.
It just makes me feel, doesn't feel good to just see someone getting pummeled in the face. Or just like getting thrown against a locker or something, or being called names, or just doesn't feel good.
So what happens to the kids who are the perpetrators?
We don't know, because they don't tell us anything, and we're not allowed to ask anything. And if we get asked, then we get questioned by like the teachers and things there. So we're not really sure. It's just like I'm trapped, like everything's trapped inside me because I can't talk about it.
The high school seems to be pretty tough. You just are supposed to not talk to people you don't know and just stay in your own lane. And it seems to be a lot of fights. I mean, with videos and cameras around, the kids often will share videos with me. I mean, I'm seeing new videos. It's almost a joke because the boys come to my house after school. There's a group of the high schoolers that ride the bus together and they come here after school and I can just overhear them talking about fights almost daily. And then there doesn't seem to be much discipline or anything for the students that are causing these issues.
When I talk to parents about what I've learned in schools, they say one of two things. They either say, I had no idea, or that's not happening in my kid's school. It's happening in most schools all over the state. The question is why. You are recording?
Take it away.
I'm talking to Becky about her daughter who goes to
Central Middle School
Central Middle School in
White Bear Lake, Minnesota. So I had a child that was in middle school, and while she was there, she just had been doing some light horseplay in class with some of her friends. She ended up being suspended for that incident.
Her daughter was routinely assaulted by another student. After repeatedly asking the administration to intercede, Becky said she got no results. She transferred her daughter out of the district.
So when we went to the school, we did ask why there wasn't any fair punishment being done, because our daughter had received such harsh punishment, we thought, for something that seemed to be very minor. So when we went to the school and asked, they didn't have any response for us. They told us not to worry about it, that it was getting taken care of, that they can't give us any information, and that was essentially the end of it. My student says that she's afraid to go to school. She feels like she's going to be jumped. She's worried about the bus. She's worried about even entering the school. She's worried about walking in. She's worried about being in the bathrooms alone. That's something that just isn't done anymore. It's not a safe place for students. So from what the girls have said, they really do have to gather in groups to even use a restroom safely. They do see a lot of things like vaping and drug use within the bathrooms, and it just doesn't seem like the school is doing a lot to handle those things. There was a group of us that did unite and go into the principal and try to talk to her about this and say we want something done. When there was nothing done and the incident continued to occur, that was when we just decided it was no longer a safe place for our child to be, and we felt like it would be best if we moved her to a different district.
Hopkins High School is in the West Metro. The situation there is similar. Last fall, during a fight in the girls' bathroom, students watched as one girl kicked another in the head until she was unconscious. Hopkins was Minnesota's first school of excellence. Parents say fights there occur almost daily. The violence and poor academic performance are chasing parents out of the district. Cell phone recordings of fights dominate Snapchat and Instagram. In Little Falls, a special ed student was sexually assaulted during the lunch hour. One student recorded while the other assaulted him. They released it on social media.
I wanted to file assault charges, and they told me that I couldn't because it was a fight.
I spoke with Kathy Johnson in the playroom of her daycare center as she told me about an assault on her grandson. She refers to him as her son. Kathy's kid attended Blaine High School, where she said 3 boys walked into her son's classroom and attacked him during class.
It all started on March 24th, 2022. I received a call from the assistant principal at the high school. 3 boys had entered the classroom from the hallway while the class was in session, surrounded his desk, and beat him. They just kept on beating him and pounding his head up against the desk. And he's got braces, so his braces were broken. He had all kinds of cuts and welts inside of his mouth. He had glasses that were broken. They flew. The teacher yelled and screamed and tried to pull the boys off of him.
The boys then posted the assault on the Blaine Fight Club Instagram page. The page has since been taken down.
One of the boys had videotaped the assault and was passing it around the rest of the school body. These boys had gone into that classroom knowing that they weren't going to get in trouble and put the kids in the classroom at risk as well as the teacher.
Although her son had to be taken to the hospital and treated for his injuries, he was expelled from school. He's never gone back.
I called the school board, and they just thanked me for bringing it to their attention 5 times in about 5 minutes, and I knew that they weren't going to do anything. And so when I had talked to the police officer again, telling him I wanted to press charges, he said he couldn't because the school wouldn't allow it. We've had multiple assaults occurring at the school.
The attack was traumatizing and left Kathy feeling angry and helpless.
So he left his friends. He was the victim, but yet he was treated more harshly than the kids that assaulted him. And I don't get it.
What kind of a boy is your son?
Good student. I'm going to tell you a story. My grandson he's my grandson. He was the ward of the court. We took him in. We got legal custody of him. And the day that we had the final papers signed, the judge told us, you keep him safe. Because he was in such an unsafe environment where he was. How do you think that makes me feel? I sent him to school where I thought he was safe. It hurts. No kid should ever go through that. And for adults to be the problem, or at least part of the problem, and not even trying to even be part of the solution, I'm appalled. Absolutely appalled.
Though the assault took place on school grounds, school officials and the school board took no action. So Kathy pressed charges. Her grandson's assailants were convicted of a fifth-degree assault and placed on probation. If schools don't report or keep records of an assault, Officer Ross said the only way to document an incident is if parents go to police. Events like the murder of Devin Scott are waking parents up to the fact that there's a problem. What's changed? A lack of consequences. Officer Mark Ross.
And when these kids never have to face a negative consequence, it gives them this kind of false sense of, they feel like Superman when they could do anything and they're not going to be hurt. It's not going to hurt them. There's not going to be any adverse consequences to the behaviors. So, yeah, again, a lot of these kids just being prepared for failure from day one. Never any consequences. And that's part of it. And it's, again, as a society, I don't know why things have gotten so violent.
Everything from swearing at teachers to fighting to doing or selling drugs in bathrooms goes unpunished. Teachers and staff have no control because there are no consequences for anything. But inaction produces results. Teachers, like families, are exiting the profession in droves, and those who can afford to are abandoning public education. This is Steve Severance. He's a former teacher in St. Paul Public Schools.
I substituted a lot of districts before I got a job in 1980, and then I ended up at St. Paul Public School System and stayed there for 37 years.
He retired in 2014 after an incident in his classroom.
We had one kid, he was expelled from Central. His brother got in a fight at lunchtime. Teachers tried to break it up. This kid almost killed John. He was a teacher, math teacher, a strong-built guy, The kid rammed his head into the cement post 2 or 3 times. John ends up now with a brain concussion, an eye disjointed, walking issues because of brain injury with it all. Got nothing out of the district other than fired for interfering.
He said the profession has changed. Severance said no one should be surprised by what happened at Harding.
The gang boy that got killed, it's unfortunate. I don't care if he's in gang or what. No child should lose their lives. However, I feel that the district, from the superintendent, from the administrative chief academic officer, and the school board are responsible that there wasn't actions to protect these kids. They kicked out the police officers in St. Paul. They said that it intimidates and tortures the kids seeing them in uniform. Principals fought this, getting the police out of the schools, Harding and Central particularly. Teachers were not happy. So now we don't have cops. However, if you go to the administration building, full security everywhere. You can't get into any office. You had to talk to the people, check in. And so it's just interesting that the administration protects themselves, but they don't protect the students in the building.
Millions and millions of dollars are being poured into the public school system, but Minnesota kids are being cheated out of a basic education, and most parents don't know. How did schools get so out of control? Why are so many teachers struggling to control their classrooms? If public schools aren't teaching kids how to read, what are they doing? Administrators in many districts in the state are pushing a single agenda. It's not a coincidence, and it's not a parent-led agenda. The violence, lack of discipline, and lax academic standards are merely tools to reach a larger objective, and it's harming kids. I wanted to do this podcast because I discovered kids are being robbed of a basic education, and I thought parents deserve to know, and our kids deserve better. I believe I know the key to fixing this problem, but first we need to know where it came from, what is wrong with it, and why. Families need to know they are not trapped. They hold the key to education freedom.
The whole thing is so upsetting that it continues to go on and everybody looks the other way.
Why do you think that is?
Because I think it's such a hole that what are they going to do? They can't depend on anybody in Minnesota Department of Education or Minnesota Department of Human Services or the Minnesota Department of Child Safety. Where do you start? But we have so many highly educated people in Minnesota and in our school district, and they can't figure it out.
This is Sheila Qualls, and you are listening to Trapped: Chaos in the Classroom. Listen to episode 2 to find out what teachers are saying and the key to fixing our education system. In the next episode, I'm going to tell you why public education is failing our kids and putting everyone who participates at risk. Trapped is a podcast from Alpha News. It's reported by me and produced by Kendall Johnson of Underdog Films. Editing by Karen Sullivan. Fact-checking by Anthony Gokowski and Greg Pullis. Our theme music is by Kendall Johnson. We have 4 more episodes coming. You'll be able to find them on our website. Subscribe at alphanews.org. This episode contains profanity.
We know that Latino kids are almost twice as likely as white kids to be suspended from school. Black kids are nearly 4 times as likely. And if a student has been suspended even once by the time they're in 9th grade, they are twice as likely to drop out.
Public education in Minnesota is imploding. It's crumbling. It's fractured. Disrespectful kids disrupt learning. Kids ignore, swear, threaten, and get physical with teachers who feel unsafe and disrespected.
There have been some discipline situations where kids have told the teachers disrespectful type of things, and that stuff is pretty unfortunate because I think it just lowers the morale of teachers, and I think there's definitely some teachers that are kind of fed up with all the things that are going on.
Is this the new norm? Weary teachers are retreating or retiring.
We're seeing a lot of teachers toward the end of their career who are saying, this just isn't fun anymore.
Administrators don't want parents to know what's going on behind closed doors, so what happens in schools stays in schools. As the bar of expectations is continually lowered, proficiency plummets. Violence is up. Schools lack accountability. Kids lack consequences. All because of an ill-conceived policy created by powerful people in the highest levels of government nearly a decade ago.
And that's why my administration has been working with schools on alternatives to the so-called zero tolerance guidelines.
Not everything that sounds good is good. They thought changing the approach to discipline from punitive to positive would teach kids to learn about each other's perspectives and build empathy and understanding. They were wrong. And that's the story I'm going to tell you in this episode. I'm Sheila Qualls. I write for a Minnesota-based news outlet called Alpha News. I've written a series of articles on ideologies, policies, and practices that allow violence, misconduct, and low performance to go unchecked. For the past 6 months, we've been examining public education. I've interviewed teachers, parents, and students. I've talked to people who study education in Minnesota. I've looked at curriculum and school websites. I've contacted the Department of Education, the Minnesota School Board Association, the Teachers Union, and administrators. I'm going to paint a picture of what is going on in our schools and why. Not in my words, but in the words of teachers, students, and parents who are in or around public schools every day. Thousands of Minnesota families are trapped, held hostage by a system that is shaped by misguided and irresponsible policies and practices that are at odds with traditional values. The threat of losing our children is real. Most teachers and parents spoke with us on the promise of anonymity. Small details have been changed to protect students' identities. They fear retaliation. Dissent is not tolerated. Disagreement is voiced only in whispers. Throughout this series, I'm going to show you everything from why kids can't read to why they have to worry about getting stabbed at school. This is episode 2 of Trapped: Chaos in the Classroom. Standardized test scores are the lowest they've been in decades. A recent report exposed 19 public schools in Minnesota that didn't have one kid proficient in math. Only 42% of kids can read at grade level. Missing deadlines, flunking tests, they go without penalty. One teacher said students can keep retaking tests until they can correctly guess enough answers to pass. And yet, graduation rates climb. In episode 1, I told you about the violence in Minnesota classrooms and how test scores fall as mayhem rises. In this episode, I'm going to show you how race-based school discipline practices and softer policies contribute to the decline in performance and an increase in chaos. This practice is called restorative justice. Basically, Black kids and white kids are not held to the same standard when it comes to behavior and discipline. I'm going to tell you how that practice became part of school culture in Minnesota and how it changed the landscape of classrooms across the country.
From the video that we have, you can see there were 3 boys guarding a door and 1 boy getting hit repeatedly. It seems like in this situation, when there was no discipline being done to any of the students of color when they were physically attacking other students, that made it feel like they were pitting the students against each other. As a parent in this world today, you do not want to be the one saying, hey, I don't think you're disciplining the children of color. That will automatically make you seem like a racist, prejudiced person. And unfortunately, that's something that the school was doing. So I felt like my hands were tied in that situation, and they were forcing me to take a look at it from that perspective.
Right. I've been teaching for over 25 years, and definitely there's been a big change in everything pertaining to the school environment outside of our content area.
This is Sue. She's taught in the Metro for 25 years. She remembers the good old days of teaching.
25 years ago, a teacher came in armed with extensive knowledge of their subject matter and great methodology and all the tricks of the trade to convey what you know, the content, the curriculum to these students. And that is not the case anymore. There's so much. It's become pressure to be more than just a conveyor of the academics. You have to also be on board for whatever they have deemed be the important things that fill out the rest of that student. More and more teachers are reporting that based on the color of a student's skin, they may or may not get the otherwise typical consequence.
Teachers are afraid. They're stressed. They expect to be assaulted.
We had another one where two girls in 5th grade beat up my colleague teacher, and the principal lied and said she slipped on food in the cafeteria. She also has short-term memory loss and partial blindness in the left eye.
How did this come to be? In 2014, data showed Black and brown kids were 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled compared to their white counterparts. Without considering any other factors like fatherless homes or economic status, the U.S. Department of Education concluded discrimination, not student behavior, was the reason for the disparities. They assumed white educators must be inherently biased. Matt Audette is a school board member in the Anoka-Hennepin School District. This idea of equity and discipline was new to him.
They'll take a look at disparities between expulsion rates of children of color versus white children in a school district. And they'll say that, if there are by count more, a disproportionate number of children of color that have been impacted or suspended or expelled, then there can only be one reason for that, and that reason must be racism. And so this started at the national level. This was discussed. The furthest I've gone back and seen discussion of it was by President Obama during the Obama administration. There was a discussion about this disparate or disproportionate impact on kids, and the federal government even tried to incentivize school districts to make changes to their practices in order to try to mitigate that. When you look at this topic of equity in these things, discipline has changed. Parents don't know this. Parents expect, so-and-so did something that's worthy of an expulsion. How come they're not being expelled? I know they're not being expelled because 3 days later they're back in the same school with my kid. How can it be? So people don't know that that's happened. So that's a pretty significant problem because basically what we have is behavioral problems that are not being dealt with, which leaves the problem children in the schools in a disrupted environment. It's not good for the rest of the kids. It's not good for the child who could have been or should have been expelled. It's not good for other children who sort of learn, as kids do. You know this from your own kids being little. They learn that where the boundaries are.
That same year, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan issued the Dear Colleague letter on discipline. This letter was to make discipline practices more equitable. The Dear Colleague letter intended to force schools to overhaul their discipline policies. In actuality, it took discipline out of the local districts and placed it in the hands of the federal government. The government was supposed to guide schools in dispensing discipline in a non-discriminatory way. The letter had a marked effect on millions of kids in classrooms across the country. Duncan said racial discrimination in school discipline is a real problem. Schools needed discipline reform. He said the problem was teacher bias, not student behavior. As part of the reform, the Department of Ed decided suspension and expulsion were harmful and damaged kids' self-esteem. They concluded these practices also feed what they called the school-to-prison pipeline. Here's the theory. Kids who are suspended or expelled are more likely to drop out of school, get into trouble, and find their way into the criminal justice system. That's the school-to-prison pipeline. Officer Mark Ross is president of the St. Paul Police Federation and a former school resource officer. He says the school-to-prison pipeline doesn't exist.
The data was what it was, and they found that they were suspending and dismissing and disciplining a disproportionate amount of black students in the district. And they thought, okay, how do we need to change this? So rather than actually put some meaningful work forward and try and change those things, they changed the way that they dealt with discipline. So they would allow the same behaviors. Previously, those behaviors would result in discipline, but no longer.
Though the Dear Colleague letter was described as non-binding, it threatened school districts with legal action if they continued to show disparities in expulsions, even if the rules were applied fairly. To curb suspensions of kids of color and make discipline more equitable, districts implemented racial equity training for teachers. The practice came with unintended consequences. Many teachers feel like they've lost the support of administrators.
I talked about how the kids, I felt like that they were not safe in my classroom as they were running out with covering their heads. I did email my superintendent and CC'd my principal because I had gone to her multiple times, nothing was happening.
This is Catherine. She teaches in the Minnetonka School District. She currently teaches 4th grade, but she's also taught kindergarten.
And I had sent pictures of what my room had looked like and just said I'm curious if the school board is aware of that this is happening in our schools, because I would love to talk to the school board about what is happening and what we need to do so we provide more support for the kids in our schools. And basically had a meeting the next day, the superintendent, in the morning before the day started, my principal's like, oh, can you come to the office? And I walked in and it was the superintendent, my principal, and another admin person, and basically was told, don't say anything. You need to just be quiet and don't go to the school board. I basically felt like it was, if you want to keep your job, don't say anything. But yeah, so.
School districts across the country made race a primary factor in determining discipline. Secretary Duncan said exclusionary discipline or expulsion is harmful and could be safely replaced with more positive methods. Instead of kicking kids out of school, educators try to resolve issues and return kids back to the classroom as soon as possible, no matter how violent the behavior. The idea was to replace punishment with talking circles. This way, wrongdoers got a chance to recognize and take responsibility for their actions instead of facing consequences. Schools began incorporating conflict resolution circles and reflection sheets that guided and mediated conversations. These practices were supposed to allow students and communities to come together and feel safe and successful. In some schools, teachers and students pass a talking stick as they share their feelings. This is a YouTube video of a restorative circle. It's not a video from a school in Minnesota, but it demonstrates the concept. So teachers and students sit in circles and talk about conflict in hopes of resolving a problem.
Today, we came together to have a circle about a problem Ms. Thomas had with Jonathan. This is the talking piece, and the talking piece is used for, we pass it around the circle, and the person who holds the talking piece is the only one who's talking. So, yeah, we're gonna start with a check-in. We should start with Ms. Thomas.
I'm a little tired from today's work, but I feel happy and good about what we may accomplish here.
Yeah, I'm feeling good. We had a nice, fun day today, feeling relaxed. We've had conversations before with Jonathan and Ms. Thomas, so I'm looking forward to continuing that and doing that work.
I'm doing good today. The reason we're here is because me and Ms. Thomas had an argument before. And so we're here to resolve that problem and trying to be in a good relationship and stuff.
I'm doing pretty well today. Well, better than I was before. And yeah, I'm excited to get the circle going.
Restorative justice practices are taking a toll on teachers. Some districts are having a hard time keeping teachers. They're quitting because students are out of control.
We had teachers assaulted, and it was a substitute teacher. So she called the police, and they put her on a blacklist where she couldn't sub in St. Paul schools anymore. At the end of her lawsuit, she walked away with $120,000 that because they were discriminatory towards her right to call the police and tell them I was assaulted. Didn't matter where.
This is Trish. She hosts a popular podcast called Teacher Therapy. Trish said she quit teaching after 8 years because she felt like she couldn't tell the truth about what was going on in the classroom. As a result, she began suffering high levels of anxiety and depression. When kids aren't held accountable, she said, they're not the best versions of themselves. This is from an episode called Out of Control Students Get Zero Consequences. Trish didn't teach in Minnesota, but many teachers in the state echoed her experience.
Oftentimes, the worst behaved kids are the ones that are getting all of the rewards because that's a teacher's only recourse. So they're trying everything that they can do to try to motivate the worst behaved kids by saying, I'll give you 25 scholar dollars. I'll give you a bag of candy. I'll give you, a 15-minute sit in the teacher's desk pass, just whatever we can think of, honestly, to motivate the most challenging students, because we know we can't just say, fine, you're sitting out of recess, or fine, that's detention for you. That's not there anymore. So what actually effectively ends up happening in a lot of these scenarios is the best behaved kids that are like always quiet and never causing a problem. Many times those kids get passed over and all of the attention still goes to the most misbehaved kids. So in weird ways, it's almost like their negative behavior is reinforced. And in even worse scenarios, believe this or not, many teachers will believe it, the worst behaved kids, if you do dare send them to the office, they will actually come back with snacks. They had iPad time. They got to spend one-on-one time with the principal, building a relationship, and oftentimes talking about how horrible the teacher is. And again, weirdly enough, a lot of these systems aren't even being used the way they're supposed to be. They're just kind of getting used in crisis mode and bribe the kid mode.
As districts adopted restorative justice, discipline went from functional and fair to tender and ineffective. It also faced scrutiny as some questioned, is this legal? Should discipline be determined by the color of a kid's skin? The main problem with restorative justice is there's no evidence that it actually works.
We have this policy in St. Paul schools and many public schools across the nation right now where children aren't held to accountability for their behavior. For example, I had a kid tell me to go get fucked. I first told him to call his father. God, he did. I was over teaching. And then I put him out of my room, sent him to the office, get the kid back in about 5 minutes with candy. And I was not happy about that. And the child says, gee, Mr. Severance, what did I get you? I put him out of my room, but you're not supposed to. You're supposed to take what they say.
Well, I am a career teacher. I taught social studies. I had a big chunk doing advanced placement U.S. history. I taught 20 semesters of African American history. I developed the first Asian American history class where the emphasis was on the immigrant experience, not just Asian studies. And I always spent time working with our at-risk ninth graders.
This is Roy Magnuson. He's retired now, but he taught in the St. Paul Public Schools for over 30 years.
I was a secondary teacher. I did some middle school, but most of my career was at the high school level. The idea that it is okay to say that we have what we used to call a culture of school, where you came to school and you brought yourself, but you also brought your materials, you brought a desire to learn, you brought a desire to be a student, and being a student involved being prepared, it involved being prompt, it involved being courteous, it involved wanting to come out of each class period or each assignment having added something to both your content base.
He said, looking back, the Dear Colleague letter wasn't such a good idea.
At some point in time, weigh the very real question that is part of the debate now, too, of where are the rights of the many to a non-disrupted learning environment sacrificed for the more singular rights of the individual or the few. We reduce the desire to say, you can do better.
Restorative justice is the demarcation line between how schools used to be and how they are now. With this new approach, teachers began to struggle to control their classrooms. A discipline policy that mandates treating kids differently based on the color of their skin is a recipe for disaster. The Dear Colleague letter was suspended in 2018, but not before it had become ingrained in school policy and culture. The damage was done. The policy was rescinded, but the practices continued. Minnesota adopted its own version of the Dear Colleague letter. Matt Audette in the Anoka-Hennepin School District.
On the academic side, it's a lot of look at the various ways that we assess performance of kids, grading standards, the traditional ABC structure of grading, testing and evaluation has been a big problem. There's statements that those systems are, the questions, the way they're designed and written are have some component of racism, or they bias or they advantage one group over another. And so we're making changes to practices called standards-based grading instead of traditional grading. And standards-based grading seems much more subjective.
In October of 2017, Minnesota Department of Human Rights Commissioner Kevin Lindsay sent a letter to 43 Minnesota districts. The letter threatened districts with investigation unless they agreed to notify the department before expelling kids of color. So in effect, they stopped expelling kids of color.
Rather than being expelled, which just adds to their record and could set kids up for a disadvantage later in life, which is true, it could, but rather than do that, they've really moved away from expulsions. And I think and that's across the board.
Lindsay's letter set off a chain of bad practices and has led to increased violence in the classroom and disorder in districts across the state.
When you take the parents out of the equation and don't involve them in any kind of change that their student might be going through at the school, or any kind of mental health, in a way is how I would see it, it can become dangerous.
The Phillips have 3 children. They attend school in Farmington.
Yeah, I'm Nick Phillips. We've lived here for about 7 years and just seen a nonstop spiral downward since we've been here.
With conventional discipline thrown aside, classroom conduct spiraled out of control. Aaron Phillips worked as a paraprofessional in the Farmington School District.
My son let me know recently of a fight between a trans girl and a biological girl at Farmington High School. I don't know the students, but I have heard that there are fights. There is vandalism at Farmington High School. The bathrooms are not a place that these kids can go comfortably. I'd walk into the bathrooms and you would have kids vaping. You have marijuana use in the bathrooms. My son says that he can smell those. Sinks have been ripped off the walls, soap dispensers. The behavior is just unbelievable, and I don't feel like anyone's really held accountable.
This is also a school district that they have 4 vice principals, 1 principal, and the superintendent, all based at the high school. Can't find subs, can't afford to pay them, can't find teachers, can't afford to pay them. But these 5-6 leadership roles within the school can't even hold these students accountable, or we continue to give them raises, but can't hire teachers to again hold them accountable. So it's this continual downward spiral. Kids think they can get away with anything, and they can, because nobody's there to stop them.
Sue teaches in the Metro. She said restorative justice is divisive, but it's alive and well in Minnetonka.
What you'd find with the restorative justice is that the color of student has become one of the primary determinants or factors in deciding how to manage this issue, this conflict. There's so much. There's so much inherent racism in that no one really wants to call out.
For decades, schools have had rules and policies that applied equally to all.
It's divisive, because then you've got other students who said, wait, I just got suspended for 2 days and got reamed, because I did this, that, the other thing, but I know that those guys did that, and nothing happened.
Sue said restorative justice practices demoralize kids of all colors because zero tolerance only applies to white kids who are held to the standards of traditional discipline.
How do you keep order
in a system where the rules apply to some, but they don't apply to others?
It's stressful. It sucks a lot of the life and the joy out of teaching every day because you're walking on eggshells. It's not just that, it's a million things that detract from just coming in, enjoying your students, getting to know your students in all the ways that make them wonderful, not the ways that they want to put out there to divide one side from the other, but all the wonderful common experience that you can, have in a classroom.
Teachers are calling it quits in more ways than one.
I just think that you're seeing a lot of teachers toward the end of their career who are saying, this just isn't fun anymore, and they're retiring. I mean, I know a lot of people who are retiring earlier than they otherwise would need to. Or, what's really unfortunate, I'm thinking of one teacher who I knew who completely, well, a couple actually, the more I think about it, who have recently switched professions. It's just not fun anymore. It's stressful.
The practices are a social contagion. Some kids take advantage because they know there are no consequences. And kids who might otherwise not act out feel peer pressure to do so.
You have 31 kids in your room. That behavior then will get the border kids who might also cause problems. Well, if he can say that to him and get away with it, then why can't I say it to him or other teachers, which some had? And I believe it's because of the process of restored justice.
This is Catherine again from Minnetonka. She said many teachers feel like their hands are tied by the state's policies.
Like, we don't have much consequences, like it is. So if a child doesn't do something right, I mean, yes, they can go to the principal's office or do something, but there's not as much of I feel like there was more of a fear. If a teacher even just, if I say I'm going to call your parents, they don't really care. But before, you could do that and they wouldn't want that. So I think that for me as a teacher is one of the biggest challenges is I feel like you tell a kid to do something, I just hope that they do it, because if they don't, there's really not much I can do if they don't do it. And that's I will have a kid this year who'll say, well, you can't make me. I'm like, you're right, I can't make you do it. But he has a smiley face, straight face, sad face chart. I can give you a sad face if you don't do what you're supposed to do. That's kind of what I hold over these kids. So that's, I think, the hardest thing is there's not consequences like there should be. And part of it is to protect the kids. It's the school districts are tied because of what the states are telling them what we can do and what can't do too.
Why do they not remove the child from class for a period of time, 3-4 days, 5 days, or discipline the child? Why is none of that done?
That's a great question. I would like to know that, but I would say it does depend on your principal, your administration, because I've had principals that are if that happens and that child is out, they're done. So that child can know that their behavior is not okay, because what I think is when they don't have a consequence, they don't see that their behavior is wrong. And then the other kids are also not seeing that their behavior is wrong too. So, depends on administration support. I think laziness on the admin, it's work for them to have to find where that child's going to be, have to make the phone calls. I will say the one time when the child went to the principal's office and destroyed her office, the child was at home that day.
She said she sees the effects of the two-tiered discipline structure on younger kids. Lenient discipline policies don't end well for the students they're supposed to help. In fact, some believe restorative justice has done more harm than good. These practices promote a lower standard of behavior among minorities and foment bitterness and resentment in others. These reforms have wreaked havoc on schools and bred a host of unintended consequences. Crafted by bureaucrats who don't spend their days in classrooms, they're clearly not working.
Any of the Somali kids were disrespectful or had any kind of discipline referral, they never went to the assistant principal or the dean anymore. They went to the cultural liaison. One student started chanting anytime I walked around the corner of my room to get something. The leader and a couple others would start chanting, F you.
A lack of consequences is making teaching and learning tough. Discipline is designed to keep order and to keep kids safe. It should have no color. But the revised practices have made students and teachers feel less safe. And when kids don't feel safe, they're less likely to learn.
I just walked outside and I stopped and I cracked the door and I could hear that they were exactly doing this, and I knew which student it was who started it. I could even see through the crack in the door. I opened up the door really quickly and looked right at him, and it was obvious he's the ringleader. So when I took that to the administration to say this is what's happening, we need a discipline referral, nope, that's when I learned it didn't even go through the regular channels. It went through the cultural liaison, and that student barely got a slap on the wrist. So much for, my first taste of restorative justice.
This is Sheila Qualls, and you're listening to Trapped, Chaos in the Classroom. Listen to episode 3 to find out more about policies and practices that are hurting our kids.
One of the principals at one of our schools put up the Ku Klux Klan mask. And first day of school, first meeting, and all the white people had to remain quiet for 15 minutes to absorb the guilt of what the Ku Klux Klan did.
Trapped is a podcast from Alpha News. It's reported by me and produced by Kendall Johnson of Underdog Films. Editing by Karen Sullivan. Fact-checking by Anthony Gokowski and Greg Pullis. Our theme music is by Kendall Johnson. We have 3 more episodes coming. You'll be able to find them on our website. Subscribe at mntrapped.com. This podcast is also available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts.
Hi, my name is Brad Taylor, and I just finished my freshman year at RHS. I've been a part of District 1 and 6 schools now for 10 years, and I'm going to give you a glimpse today of what's actually going on inside these schools.
Brad Taylor is a white kid who attended Rosemont High School. His speech went viral when he spoke before the Rosemont School Board 2 years ago. His mom said millions of people have watched it.
Despite the board's attempt to deny it, District 1 and 6 schools are quickly becoming a place where promoting activism is actually more important than promoting education.
Sometimes students are our best teachers. In this case, Brad Taylor was the teacher and the school board members were the students.
I'll take you back to my first day at RHS this fall. The principal came out and gave us a heartfelt speech about equality and standing together. He began to list countless races, such as Latino, Asian, expressing how much they matter and how important they are. But never once did he mention a race or identity that reflects me, or half the kids that were in the class.
In the name of social justice, teachers and administrators are trying to turn students into activists. Last episode, I told you how schools are willing to sacrifice student safety in the name of social justice. They created practices that stopped the suspensions of Black and brown kids, even if it created a less safe environment for everyone else. Once you realize schools are willing to sacrifice safety for social justice, you have to ask, what else are they willing to sacrifice? I started this series by telling you public education in Minnesota is broken. Kids are being cheated out of a basic education, and most parents don't know. What's happening in schools looks a lot like education, but it's not. The line between parent and teacher is being blurred. Schools lack boundaries and accountability. Some parents are slowly figuring that out. They're the angry ones. They've been showing up at school board meetings the past few years. They ask tough questions. Most school board members and superintendents don't like it. Parents have reason to be angry. Half of Minnesota kids can't read at grade level, and more than half can't perform grade level math. Clearly, kids aren't being taught basic literacy and numeracy skills. In this episode, I'm going to tell you what they're being taught instead. I'm Sheila Qualls. I write for a Minnesota-based news outlet called Alpha News. I've written a series of articles on ideologies, policies, and practices that allow violence, misconduct, and low performance to go unchecked. For the past 6 months, we've been examining public education. I've interviewed teachers, parents, and students. I've talked to people who study education in Minnesota. I've looked at curriculum and school websites. I've contacted the Department of Education, the Minnesota School Board Association, the Teachers Union, and administrators. I'm going to paint a picture of what is going on in our schools and why. Not in my words, but in the words of teachers, students, and parents who are in or around public schools every day. Thousands of Minnesota families are trapped, held hostage by a system that is shaped by misguided and irresponsible policies and practices that are at odds with traditional values. The threat of losing our children is real. Most teachers and parents spoke with us on the promise of anonymity. Small details have been changed to protect students' identities. They fear retaliation. Dissent is not tolerated. Disagreement is voiced only in whispers. Throughout this series, I'm going to show you everything from why kids can't read to why they have to worry about getting stabbed at school. This is episode 3 of Trapped: Chaos in the Classroom. Last episode, I told you how schools are willing to sacrifice student safety in the name of social justice. They dramatically changed discipline practices to tamp down on the number of Black and brown students who were suspended. If educators are willing to sacrifice kids' safety on the altar of ideology, what else are they willing to sacrifice? They're willing to sacrifice learning. At least that's what the evidence indicates.
We see a very long-term trend of free-falling test scores, stagnant academic growth, persistent and stubborn achievement gaps, widening in some instances, and when they are closing, they're closing for the wrong reasons and in the wrong direction.
Policies have consequences. In Minneapolis, only 1 in 3 students is proficient in math. The trend is not limited to metro schools. In Woodbury, math scores have dramatically dropped since 2018. Kids know they will not be held to account. They suffer no consequences. They fight, swear, wield weapons, and do and sell drugs, creating an unsafe classroom environment for everyone. How could more students be graduating when fewer are passing standardized tests? How is this happening? Max Eden is a research fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based think tank, American Enterprise Institute. He's been researching, writing, and speaking about education policy for the better part of the past decade. I spoke with him by phone, so the audio's not as good.
Schools are willing to systematically sacrifice student safety in the name of racial statistics, right? They would sooner decrease suspensions across the board, decrease suspensions for one particular ethnic group than do what it takes to keep kids safe, to the extent that that actually creates more chaotic and terrible classroom environments that doesn't actually bother the people who are responsible for the schools, just so long as on paper it looks like they are running towards or achieving greater social justice. And so if you have a set of institutions that are willing to sacrifice the safety and stability of children for the sake of their ideology, then you have to ask, well, what else are they willing to sacrifice for the sake of their ideology?
Learning has gone from objective to subjective, and academic content is being replaced by ideology. Little Falls standardized test scores have been on a steady decline since 2018. Less than 40% of students are proficient in reading, and less than 35% are proficient in math and science. Yet first graders at Dr. S.G. Knight Elementary School start their days by telling their teacher about their feelings, and the teacher records their answers on her cell phone.
But they go to school every morning, and they have to circle what their feeling is. This is a daily thing.
Renee Krause's grandkid goes to S.G. Knight.
They circle what their feeling is, and then she has to talk into her iPad and say why she's tired. Now they go sit on the rug, and then the teacher has her cell phone, and then she records what the kids will actually sit down and say to the class that, I circled the tired face, and this is why I'm tired.
She said most parents have no idea what's going on inside the classroom.
I only ask my granddaughter because I know things are going on, so I ask questions. The average parent isn't saying, did you circle an emotion face today? The kids aren't coming home and telling them, because it's no different than playing with Susie on the swing.
And has anyone called the school and said, why do you do that?
No, because all the kids are participating in it. It's just, they're seriously taking up class time for this. And fourth graders can't read in Minnesota.
Krause said pride flags are displayed in most hallways and classrooms.
They can't read, but they're so bent on teaching all this social emotional learning and all this pride stuff, and that yet they deny it, but they're doing it.
Anthony is a 9th grader at White Bear Lake. I introduced him in the first episode. You may remember, he was the kid who was getting beat up on the school bus every day, and the kid who was assaulting him was not suspended or even disciplined. During my interview with Anthony, we talked about baseball. He plays outfield, and his favorite team is the Twins. Anthony is a B student, so I was surprised to learn how little he knew about American history.
I don't know a lot about the founding of our country.
Do you know anything about the Revolutionary War?
I don't know anything about the Revolutionary War.
The Civil War?
I do not know anything about the Civil War.
War of 1812?
Nothing about the War of 1812. I would like to learn about how our country became what it is and what it happened to make us a country. And I just don't feel that's what I'm going to learn in this school year.
So if someone came to you, if someone from another country came to you and said they weren't American and they said, hey, tell me what America is about, what would you say?
I don't know.
Anthony's responses made me curious. Is he the only student not learning about the founding of our country? To find out, I visited the campus of a prestigious university. I walked with students as they hurried to class on a snowy day. I asked students questions from the U.S. citizenship test. It's the test immigrants must master to become American citizens. The idea of self-government is found in the first 3 words of the Constitution. What are they?
We the people.
What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution?
The Bill of Rights.
This student did well. Why did the colonists fight the Revolutionary War?
Britain imposing taxes.
When was the Declaration of Independence adopted?
Sometime in the late 1700s.
Who's the father of our country?
George Washington.
And what is the name of our national anthem?
The Star-Spangled Banner.
But most students didn't do as well. What do we call the first 10 amendments of the Constitution?
I don't know. I think it's I couldn't tell you a certainty. Original 10, maybe?
The 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
Why did the colonists fight the Revolutionary War?
No clue.
Who is the father of our country?
I have no idea.
When was the Declaration of Independence adopted?
Maybe 1814. I have no idea. I think it's 14 something.
Why did the colonists fight in the Revolutionary War?
See, I know this, but I don't.
When was the Declaration of Independence adopted?
1863.
Kids don't know American history because they aren't being taught American history. Steve Severance is a former St. Paul teacher. He said no one should be surprised kids don't know American history. When he taught in St. Paul, history was one of the subjects he wasn't allowed to teach.
I interviewed for a job at a private school here, and he said, do you have any questions for me? I said, well, do you teach spelling? Yeah. I said, well, how about social studies? Yeah. Grammar? He said, where are you from? I said, St. Paul Public Schools were allowed to teach it.
American Enterprise Institute's Max Eden continues explaining what's happened. He said many schools have abandoned what would be considered traditional learning objectives. They've also abandoned methods that work, like using phonics to teach kids to read. Reading is being sacrificed on the altar of social justice ideology.
The one thing that we basically do know for a matter of scientific fact is that phonemic awareness is the correct way to teach reading.
Eden says that although it's well established that phonics is the best way to teach kids to read, it's been replaced by whole language, which is more focused on how kids feel than on whether they can decipher words.
That's been thoroughly validated by people who aren't, researchers in schools of education, but people who are researchers in the fields of cognitive science and neurodevelopment. So we've known for a few decades that phonics and phonemic awareness, as it's called, the science of reading, is the way that kids should be taught, but it has not actually penetrated into the mainstream because the gatekeepers of teachers, the people who train the teachers, people in teachers' colleges, are convinced politically that phonics is an inherently conservative or Republican approach to reading, and that their student-based cueing kind of whole language model is much more in touch with childhood and in touch with proper feelings and can spark joy and passion.
He said public schools have been using flawed methodology to teach reading for at least 2 decades. Math is on the altar as well. Amazingly, the way kids have learned math for decades is now considered racist.
How do you get to the point ideologically where you make that claim that showing your work and going by a rigorous kind of mathematical method is part of white supremacism, and then you realize, wait, they define kind of the fundaments of just the way that the world is structured socially and even in terms of kind of math and science as oppression, as white supremacy, and see the role of teaching not to get kids to understand math better, because math is inherently a white supremacist construct, but to understand that math is a white supremacist construct. And if you can see quote-unquote white supremacism or racism or fascism in math, then you can see it everywhere. When you can maybe force a parent to look at the absurdity of 2 + 2 can equal 5, then maybe you can start to get them to realize, again, just how much of what they think is happening in schools isn't happening because it's being sacrificed to the altar of ideology.
Standardized test scores are plummeting. Kids continue to be promoted whether or not they've mastered basic concepts and skills. That's not to say they aren't learning. They are learning, just not the fundamentals. Public schools have been transformed into ideological institutions where kids learn to view the world through the eyes of the oppressed and then ask themselves, what can I do about it?
One of the principals at one of our schools put up the Ku Klux Klan mask, and all the white people had to remain quiet for 15 minutes to absorb the guilt of what the Ku Klux Klan did.
Some kids are learning they're privileged. Others are learning they're victims. They're all learning the color of their skin is the most important thing about them. Gender ideology is a topic for all kids. I learned that from Cassie Frederigill and her daughter Cheyenne. We met at their home.
I have 4 children. One graduated during COVID, my oldest son, and then I have one daughter at the Little Falls High School, and then 2 children at Dr. S.G. Knight in Radle, Minnesota.
Cheyenne is in 5th grade.
I'm in 5th grade, and there's a lot of girls in our class that are bisexual and that are dating. There's 3 couples that are dating that are girls, and then there's 1 straight couple dating.
Cheyenne shared the messages she's getting at school.
It's okay to not know who you are and what your sexuality is that it's okay to be anything and that you're, meant to be you at school. Is what a lot of the times that I hear the teachers say, it's okay to be you. Yeah, you can just be you. And it's a little bit annoying because a lot of girls are like non-binary or pansexual, bi, lesbian, or transgender. And I know all of this just from them talking at lunch.
Cassie was most concerned when Cheyenne informed her she was taking a sexting class at school.
Cheyenne came home one day and told me, Mom, there's going to be a class on sexting. And, as a mother, I'm like, wait, what?
Cassie contacted the teacher and asked to see the curriculum.
I email her teacher, and I'm like, hey, what is this class? As a parent, you don't always take your child's word. So, I just want to follow up. Is this going to be a class that you're teaching?
Cheyenne's teacher took a week to respond.
And her response was, if you have questions about it, then you need to contact the social worker about it because she's going to be the woman teaching the class.
So Cassie contacted the social worker.
Are you going to be teaching these minor children about sexting? If so, can you just help me understand or know what the class is.
The social worker refused to respond. Cassie finally received a response from the principal. He said the class was a follow-up from a class Cheyenne had in 4th grade. Cassie still wanted to review the curriculum.
I'm like, what could you be showing 10-year-olds about sexting? This has nothing to do with education other than things that she should be learning at home. Our children, family foundation is like where they learn their social emotional well-being. Leave the drama at home. Learn about the Declaration of Independence at school. That's their job. This is my job.
When Cassie insisted on seeing the curriculum, she received an email from Little Falls Superintendent Greg Johnson. He told her she was no longer allowed to speak to Cheyenne's teacher, the social worker, or any other teachers at school.
Pretty much as a restraining order from the school and the teachers and everyone else. And that's when my daughter also started noticing the teacher starting to ignore her and treat her differently as well.
Why would a superintendent feel empowered to blackball a parent? Parents send their kids to school every day believing the system has their kids' best interest at heart.
Our principal's attempt to unify us, he instead created unwarranted boundaries and barriers between his students, pitting us against each other based on characteristics that we can't control.
Brad Taylor left District 196 to continue his education online. But before he left, he gave District 196 sort of a warning.
Because someday I'm going to be a leader. I may be the president, a governor, or just a professional golfer. But I will never stop believing that everybody has value, no matter their skin color or personal beliefs. And it's a shame that you're not going to be able to say that I was an alumni of RHS in District 196.
I was curious about Brad's thoughts 2 years after he left public school for a private school. I spoke with Brad and his mother Tiffany at their home.
How do you feel, or what do you think hearing that now?
I sound a little bit different, a little bit higher voice. I haven't actually heard that in a while, so that was interesting to hear again.
I asked Brad, what's the effect of teaching kids to evaluate others through a lens of race?
I think it's horrible. I think that it divides the students. I think that it makes them feel like I said in the speech, that some of them matter less because of their skin color, which is the kind of stuff that they were doing in the 1960s and 70s. And I think that's just a stupid thing to do. I should be saying, everybody matters.
Tiffany graduated from Rosemont. She said they were excellent schools. She said she noticed a shift during COVID when her kids were having classes via Zoom.
They started doing learning at home, and I was here and I would watch some of the things they would teach them. But there was one really specific incident that was kind of like the end where I couldn't deal with anymore, where he was in a classroom. Do you want to explain it? Or do you want me to? You want to explain what happened? Okay.
I was in algebra class, and it was the last class of the day, so everybody was kind of already riled up and, tired, wanting to go home.
During a math trivia game, in which kids could choose to take a different name, Brad chose the name of a prominent conservative politician.
And the teacher noticed it, and she said, "Who has that as their name?" And I said, "That's me." And she was like, "You have to take that off. We don't do political names or political stuff at school." She had a bunch of political signs in her room, so one of the ones she had was all rainbow letters, and then it said, "No one is illegal, trans lives matter," all these slogans. And so I said, well, if I have to take off my name because it's political, you should have to take down your sign because it's political. And she said, "No, it's not political, it's a human rights sign." And she got really offended by that, almost brought to tears, oh, it's a human rights sign, whatever. And eventually this other kid just randomly came up to my desk and he said, "F you." But he said the word, obviously. And the teacher said, I expect her to be like, I can't go that far. I can't go swear at people. And she said, "I agree with you," to the kid, or "I agree with your sentiment." And I was like, whoa, this kid just came up to me and sweared in my face. You agreed with him?
Math scores in Brad's district, Rosemont, Apple Valley, Egan, have dropped 14% in 4 years. Tiffany called the school.
I was bothered by many things. One, that this was a math class and they were talking about social issues and whatever. I felt like as the teacher, if you're a math teacher, you say, well, we're not going to talk about this now. Let's just move on, whatever. Letting another child who was a Black student come into his space curse at him, intimidate him, had no repercussions whatsoever, made me honestly worried for his safety in that class. This was algebra, like he said. I was just like, what is happening here? Like, my kid can't even go to an algebra class and learn algebra. That's all I want from the school. I don't need them to teach him to be, a social, justice warrior. I don't want that. I want him just to learn school. I want him to learn the basic things.
She went to the school for a meeting.
It was me, it was the teacher, the algebra teacher. So it was her, me, and it was an assistant principal. And we went over our same concerns and about the signs at RHS. And he said, well, the teachers can put up whatever signs they want. So I was like, oh, so if a teacher wanted to put up a conservative sign, that would be okay. And he was like, yeah. And I was like, well, are there any? And he's like, I don't think so. I'm like, nope, there aren't.
Tiffany said it was at that meeting that she decided she could no longer send her kids to public school.
One of his quotes that really made the light bulb go on that I cannot have my kids go to public school anymore was he said, white people have a pretty good situation right now. And he told my son that to even ask why we can't tell all the students that everyone matters was offensive. Outlandish and offensive. Kind of shamed him next to me. So I kind of got through the meeting and then knew in my heart, we're done. I'm pulling them from this school.
Although the family had to make sacrifices, she said she doesn't regret it.
We are average, middle-class family. We don't have thousands of dollars to send him to private school. We had to use his college fund to pay for private school, which after next year, it'll be empty. So we feel like that was more important than, saving it for later. Why do I live in this community paying all these property taxes when my kids are not able to go to these public schools? Because I don't trust what they're teaching my kids.
Social justice isn't just about race. It's about gender, too. Kids are learning they can choose their gender regardless of biology. And if their parents aren't on board, teachers will be. Some schools have policies that allow kids to socially transition at school and keep it a secret from parents. Administrators who should be working with parents many times work against them.
That bond of trust is essential, and it's always been honored. It's a contract that's assumed between parent and teacher, that there's a great sense of betrayal.
Yeah, my name is Dave. I'm a parent in South Washington County.
I spoke with Dave by phone, so the audio may sound a little different. Dave's kid felt like he was in the wrong body and wanted to change his name.
We were contacted by Woodbury High School, and they asked us if we were okay with a name change.
Dave and his wife told administrators they did not have permission to change their child's name and pronouns in school records.
We kind of gave them a little bit of detail to say, we've got some mental health issues that we're making progress on, and we're trying to work through as a family, and we didn't want additional things to work through at the school.
Woodbury administrators changed his kid's name and pronouns anyway.
And their reply was, well, we're fostering gender diversity, so your child is able to change their name regardless of what you say. And we were pretty much taken aback by that response. We thought that the school up to that point was our partner. They seemed like they were a fairly neutral party, but come to find out based on things we were seeing around the school and the hallways and whatnot, there's definitely an agenda going on. They've picked a side and they're sticking by that side, whether it's right or wrong or for the kids' best interest or not.
The school counselor told Dave and his wife that going along with the name change would help their child.
We actually were told by a school counselor that all our mental health issues would go away if we just, did what our child wanted and referred to them by this name and pronouns and things like that. Again, it was just like a slap in the face. Like, they're not sitting in on counseling sessions with us. We've been dealing with these mental health issues for 5-6 years and it had nothing to do with any of this gender stuff. This was just the latest thing that our child was doing.
The name change was frustrating. Not everyone at school was aware of the change, which added to the confusion.
It's caused issues with busing when we had to change busing. They didn't know who our child was. And we've had absences when our child was in school. So it's not just a matter of, it bothered us. It was actually causing regular everyday issues at the school.
Dave said he felt betrayed as a parent.
So hard to go into parent-teacher conferences because then the teachers have that name and they've been hearing it, so that's what they're using. And you're like, well, that's not my child's name. And we would correct them at first, but then you start to get, the side eye from the teachers thinking, oh, these, they're thinking something about you, like you're some kind of hateful, bigoted parent. And it's like, it's just really awkward.
Dave said he felt as if the administration trampled his parental rights. He hasn't shared his story publicly. He's afraid Woodbury administrators will stop accommodating his child's mental health needs if he does.
Somehow we're in this weird world now where biological gender and sexual identity are somehow able to be malleable and separated from each other.
So schools absolutely deny that they are doing what has happened to you. What is your response to schools? Because that's the line. They're saying we're not doing anything behind the parents' back. We're working with the parents.
It's lies, and if anything, they're bending the truth. In our case, sure, they notified us, but then it seemed like we had the option to say no, but then when we did, they said too bad. It's not their say. I'm sending my kid there to be educated, not to be manipulated, not to be indoctrinated. Well, they need to get back to educating our kids.
Teachers have been encouraged to give every student a form at the beginning of the year. Things do you like to do? What are your hobbies? What are your preferred pronouns? And I think that opens the door to a lot of this, double identity issue, school identity, home identity, when a school asks a student that.
Sue taught in Minnetonka for nearly 25 years.
I don't think the term mandatory has been used, but it's widespread. So in a faculty meeting, they'll say, we would like you to do this.
She thinks the practice plants ideas in kids' heads.
Oh, look, I've got a choice. Well, now I have to think about that. What if I'm kind of like this? What if I'm kind of like that? Only now you got trans thrown in there. What if I'm just going to be this year, at the start of this year, I'm just going to try to be much more outgoing and smile a lot. Or this year, I'm just going to kind of be a listener and a watcher. I'm not going to be too involved. Or what if I'm going to identify myself as I'm going to go out for this activity or that activity or this new sport? I'm going to try to be a jock. Maybe I'll be a musician. Maybe I'll run for student government. Or maybe I'll try out being a trans.
Sue said some schools are setting up confidential reporting lines so kids and parents can report teachers who don't toe the line.
I think that's becoming more common among the schools, is that they are setting up what they would call anti-bullying or anti-harassment. They're setting up confidential reporting mechanisms for the community to use.
So confidential reporting mechanisms, that almost sounds like Nazi Germany.
That's exactly what many teachers have commented among themselves, because certainly teachers are coming up on these reporting lines. And I just think it's shown a reprehensible lapse of judgment among administrators to think that students and parents wouldn't abuse or at least misuse that type of instrument.
Tell me about the experience you had with a student who wanted to change their pronoun and you got an email from an administrator. Can you share that experience?
Right. It was just a brief email.
Sue shared a copy of the email that went out to 7 or 8 other staff members.
It says, "Hey team, I had a conversation with a student this morning and wanted to pass the information along to you on his behalf. The student would prefer to be called using the pronouns he, him in class. However, when contacting parents, use There's the name she, her. Thank you.
And so what's your reaction to that?
Well, it caused me to think about it for a long time, and I still do.
She said administrators shouldn't be encouraging students to keep secrets from parents because when they do, they inject themselves into the parent-child relationship.
I think it's totally wrong. It should be illegal that any school organization could withhold information about their own student from the parent, a minor child. But that's part of the thinking that's been creeping in.
She said parents should ask what teachers are learning during in-service days.
So when students are home for the day because it's professional development day for the teachers, parents might want to ask, well, what are our teachers learning about today?
She said districts hire highly paid consultants to go into schools to train teachers how to be on board with gender ideology. She remembers a workshop where teachers were taught how to frame discussions when speaking with students.
The woman who came in and gave an example of a kindergarten teacher and said, if you are a kindergarten teacher and parents come in the first day and say, well, good morning, this is our son Tommy, and Tommy is kind of thinking these days that he wants to be Tina, but we expect him to be called Tommy. And then the parents leave, and your first day of kindergarten begins, and the student comes up and says, hi, my name is Tina. What are you going to do? And that was a discussion topic among the tables at the professional development. And when we got back to the presenter, she unequivocally stated, oh no, you need to call that student Tina. That's what the student wants. So you've got administrators now who kind of bought into that way of thinking.
She said administrators have overstepped. She said there should be a three-pronged relationship that includes students, parents, and teachers. Instead of working together as a team to help kids be successful, some administrators are forming alliances between students and teachers while putting parents and students at odds. As Dave said about his experience at Woodbury High School, administrators are usurping parental authority.
It'll never be right to take parents out of the equation. A good teacher would never, ever consider a parent as not the essential part of the team that you need.
Kids can't read. They can't spell. They lack knowledge of basic rules of grammar, punctuation, and math. And they spend their class time choosing pronouns independent of gender, learning skin color determines who you are, and denying facts in favor of feelings. Most teachers go into teaching because they want to help kids. They want to give them the tools they need to be successful. Lynn has been a teacher since the early 90s. She has taught in districts all over the metro. You know, so many teachers are afraid to speak out. What emboldened you to speak out?
I am nearing the end of my career, so there's that, right? And you know what? I taught in a different environment. I taught when I actually got to be able to reach my students, so I know what it can be like, and I know what it's like now.
She decided to speak out because younger teachers are exiting the profession. Last year, 4,700 teachers in Minnesota decided to stop teaching.
A lot of these younger teachers don't know what it used to be like, and to the point where they're like, well, this is so awful that I'm not even going to be in this profession after 5 years. And we are not doing right by our students. We're just not. Our job as educators is to help prepare every generation of students to be contributing members of society. And when we are focusing on the things that don't matter and our kids are leaving our high schools and they can't read and they can't do basic math, we are doing such a disservice to them. You don't take an oath as a teacher, but you sort of do. Like, my job is to help educate these kids so that they can go out in the world and be successful and happy and contribute to our society. And we're not doing that for our kids. We're not. And it's wrong. It's wrong, and it's going to bite us in the butt eventually. And I hope that's not by design. I really do. Because again, I would hate to think that people in my profession were doing that to children, but it feels like it is sometimes, doesn't it?
Jane teaches in Prior Lake Savage area schools.
In our district, part of the 4th grade curriculum is that they read Number the Stars.
Number the Stars is about a family that helps a Jewish family hide during the Nazi invasion of Denmark. Dean said the book eerily parallels what is happening today and is another example of how students sometimes are the best teachers.
A colleague of mine said that last spring she was reading the book to her class as a read aloud. So spring of 2022. And one of her students said, how did they not know what they were doing? And she just said, I looked at them and thought, how do you guys not know what's going on? It's right in front of your faces. But you don't want to believe that the people that you trust and that your government would hurt you.
This is Sheila Qualls, and you are listening to Trapped: Chaos in the Classroom. Listen to episode 4 to find out about the origins of these policies and practices that are hurting our kids.
No, we need to decolonize and disrupt whiteness. It pervades everything that we do, how we start a meeting even. Agenda items. That's whiteness, right?
We're going to push these systems and we're going to use these systems to the best of our ability. And then when we can destroy them, we're going to keep destroying. So destroying capitalism is a part of our freedom dream, is a part of the long-term goal. But like we know, folks like this tell us, is that we need a 40-year plan. We need a 50-year plan for freedom. And anti-capitalism is part of that 50, 60-year plan towards freedom.
If you know of chaos in a classroom, email me at sheila@alphanews.org or contact the Alpha News tip line at alphanews.org. Trapped is a podcast from Alpha News. It's reported by me and produced by Kendall Johnson of Underdog Films. Editing by Karen Sullivan. Fact-checking by Anthony Gokowski and Greg Pullis. Our theme music is by Kendall Johnson. We have 2 more episodes coming. You'll be able to find all episodes on our website. Subscribe at mntrapped.com. This podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts.
I've heard dozens of them. Instead of talking about privilege, they now call it circumstance. They started teaching social and emotional learning as a Trojan horse for critical race theory in math classes. And in some states, when parents caught on to that, they started calling that something else. It's an endless game of whack-a-mole, and these pros are always going to stay one step ahead of the parents.
In the first 3 episodes of Trapped, I described how educators are willing to sacrifice kids' safety and learning in the name of social justice. In this episode, I'm going to tell you how Minnesota educators are moving kids towards cultural change using a method called social emotional learning. Social emotional learning has become more important than teaching kids to read and write.
Critical race theory is an academic theory. It's the ideology that drives all of this. But diversity and inclusion and equity, that's the marketing scheme that sounds good, and our workplaces do it, and our at places of, our schools do it. But social emotional learning is the delivery system of that into the schools.
The name suggests it's about teaching kids about kindness and how to manage emotions, which sounds really good. But how many parents know what it really is? I'm going to tell you what social emotional learning is and how educators have convinced parents it's a good idea. But is it? I'm Sheila Qualls. I write for a Minnesota-based news outlet called Alpha News. I've written a series of articles on ideologies, policies, and practices that allow violence, misconduct, and low performance to go unchecked. For the past 6 months, we've been examining public education. I've interviewed teachers, parents, and students. I've talked to people who study education in Minnesota. I've looked at curriculum and school websites. I've contacted the Department of Education, the Minnesota School Board Association, the Teachers Union, and administrators. I'm going to paint a picture of what is going on in our schools and why. Not in my words, but in the words of teachers, students, and parents who are in or around public schools every day. Thousands of Minnesota families are trapped, held hostage by a system that is shaped by misguided and irresponsible policies and practices that are at odds with traditional values. The threat of losing our children is real. Most teachers and parents spoke with us on the promise of anonymity. Small details have been changed to protect students' identities. They fear retaliation. Dissent is not tolerated. Disagreement is voiced only in whispers. Throughout this series, I'm going to show you everything from why kids can't read to why they have to worry about getting stabbed at school. This is episode 4 of Trapped: Chaos in the Classroom. Some interviews in this episode were done in studio and some were captured over the phone. Something is happening in Minnesota's schools, and most parents don't know. Many teachers I spoke with became teachers because they wanted to help kids. In fact, they want to help kids so badly they've convinced themselves that what they're doing is preparing kids for success. Minnesota districts are spending millions of dollars on social-emotional learning.
CASEL, which is the organization that really supports the framework for 90% of these programs, CASEL is an acronym for the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning.
Christine Troyan is the executive director of Minnesota Parents Alliance. MPA is a nonpartisan group formed to educate and empower parents to advocate for their kids.
They define it as a transformational process, and it calls for kids to redistribute power to promote social justice. And they say that, and that is really right up front. It's something that you can easily find on their website, so they really are not being deceptive about it. But that is not what your school principal will lead with, and that is not what, the schoolroom teacher necessarily even thinks that it is.
Education is a process in which teachers present a set of interconnected facts that build upon each other, like blocks. It's called knowledge-based learning. Max Eden is a fellow at American Enterprise Institute.
One of the things that we know works kind of beyond a shadow of a doubt, there was just recently a study that came out last week, actually, that showed that it worked dramatically, is knowledge-based curriculum, which most parents probably think their kids are getting, but they're not.
The goals have changed, so the methods have changed. Kids are no longer developing critical thinking skills. They're learning to focus on feelings and changing social outcomes. If teachers really want kids to be successful, why have they abandoned methods that work? And when parents probe, why do administrators or teachers shut them out or try to marginalize them?
And they're not doing this because they're inherently radical, or that they're all inherently the kind of blue-haired people that you see on lips of TikTok. A lot of them are doing it because that's simply what they were trained to do.
He said schools of education are teaching a pedagogy which is steeped in ideologies most parents wouldn't agree with.
Instead of America having a kind of a common American identity, instead of there being a set of facts that all Americans should know, instead of trying to systematically build knowledge on the assumption that, all kids in our society should at least share some set of facts and some basic kind of dispositional values, it starts to balkanize students kind of both socially, politically, and even in terms of knowledge to get them to think more about themselves and their race and their sex and their gender.
Schools have a finite amount of money and time to educate kids in the fundamentals, reading, writing, arithmetic. With test scores taking a dive, why aren't schools laser focused on improving academic outcomes? Troyan said, social emotional learning is in every school in Minnesota.
I, as a parent of young children, hear social emotional learning. Initially, I thought, great, that means kindness and teaching kids self-regulation and being good citizens, and it is none of those things.
And most parents don't know what it is.
I think that is just one of the most, frankly, disgusting things about these programs. And, I've been in rooms where people have been talking about, how these social emotional learning programs work. And that's the thing that makes your stomach churn the most, is because truly these programs rely on the fact that the students that they're teaching have a natural desire to be kind, good, citizens of their school and their communities. And, kids want to be good. And then they want the praise that goes along with it for being, a caring, kind, respectful student. So these social emotional learning programs often sort of prey on that natural, desire to be empathetic, kind little people. And teach them that, hey, in order to do that, you need to really set aside your own personal feelings or fears or whatever it may be, and think about how this other person feels. And the way that then we see that play out, and I think this is a good example that makes it clear, is that let's say that you have a kindergarten little girl in a restroom, and all of a sudden a male walks into the restroom. She is being conditioned, taught, trained to say, you know what, I am going to consider the feelings of this biological male who's just walked in, and although her instinct is, I feel a little unsafe, this doesn't feel right to me, I'm going to try to set those feelings aside and think about this individual first. That's where my empathy is going to come into play. And she's going to get praised for that in a social emotional learning program.
She said kids are driven towards the one right answer, and parents' natural protective instinct is disarmed.
It is not like, let's have an open conversation about, what do you feel the right thing is to do? I mean, they really are funneling these children into, there is one correct response here in the way that the social emotional learning programs view this. And then I think the other part is parents have also had their, sort of desire to be empathetic people weaponized against them. And I think what you see is that a parent who might say, oh, wow, like I just saw this come home in a backpack, or I'm looking at this book and it's, either pornographic or violent, or, some other content is objectionable here. And I'm going to confront my either teacher or administrator about my concerns. And then that teacher or administrator will say, like, oh, well, you don't want people to be bullied. Like, we need to start, teaching kids about this now. And, you don't care about, trans kids or, children of other different races. And I think then that really, takes the wind out of their sails a little bit. It's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, no, I definitely do not want to be called any of those things. And it actually results in them kind of pushing away their natural instinct to advocate for the safety of their own children. And so I think that, I think that is one of the most concerning and, again, just sort of stomach-churning things about this, is it's really preventing both parents from really naturally being the strongest and best advocates for their children.
SEL functions like a mime. Mimes don't use words, but those who watch the performance understand exactly what they're communicating. The teachers are the mimes and the kids are the audience. By carefully using certain terms, privilege, equity, oppression, inclusion, diversity, and carefully avoiding others, educators are infusing principles and ideologies into kids without ever telling them or their parents what it is.
We're going to push these systems, and we're going to use these systems to the best of our ability. And then when we can destroy them, we're going to keep destroying. So destroying capitalism is a part of our freedom dream, is a part of the long-term goal. But like we know, folks like this tell us, is that we need a 40-year plan. We need a 50-year plan for freedom. And anti-capitalism is part of that 50, 60-year plan towards freedom.
This video was used in a 2021 teacher training for educators in Minnesota's largest school district, Anoka-Hennepin. It's called Abolitionist Teaching and the Future of Our Schools. It was put on by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. If this is what teachers are learning, it's what kids are learning too. So why are Minnesota teachers learning capitalism needs to be destroyed and then passing that information along to kids? Do parents know? Troyan said there are a number of problems with SEL.
A lot of parents come to us and say, okay, well, our school uses Second Step. That's a very common one. And when you actually request the curriculum, which every single parent should do, and you go through it, you'll see that Second Step encourages kids to choose a disruption strategy, right? So even just language like that, I think, especially, again, at the elementary school level, to teach kids to disrupt the system. This is all about, critical theory in general is about dismantling systems of power.
SEL is the delivery method through which these messages are being downloaded into kids. Instead of learning about the principles of democracy and freedom, kids are learning about countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and China.
You can't teach young children critical race theory in its sort of, more complicated academic sense. How do you teach young kids, and how do you get this into the curriculum? Social emotional learning is the delivery system.
Equity is one of the fundamentals of SEL. Equity sounds like a good thing. It sounds a lot like equality. It's anything but. To be equitable means ignoring merit, and focusing on equal outcomes, regardless of effort or ability.
To make this all the more complicated, CRT, critical race theory, there's another CRT, and it's called culturally responsive teaching.
Another hallmark of SEL is raising kids' consciousness of oppression. Kids are taught adults have created an oppressive system. So adults who care for them and about them are part of the problem. And kids are encouraged to become part of the solution without having all the facts or the maturity to comprehend the complexity of the situation.
It starts to balkanize students to get them to think more about themselves and their race and their sex and their gender, see themselves more as members in these abstract entity groups that they're frequently being taught have, whose place in society is to try to overturn an unjust order, which is an incredibly attractive thing for a kid to hear. It's an incredibly attractive thing for a teacher to say, because it sounds much more attractive to think I'm teaching to change the world than it does to think I'm teaching to help these kids learn how to do reading and math marginally better. And if you're a kid, it's a lot easier to take pride in the illusion that because you've adopted a set of beliefs or disposition, you're part of this grander project of taking the world than it is to just put your nose to the grindstone and study more effectively and try to raise your grades. And so that's all to say, with safety as a jumping off point, you have a system that's proven quite willing to put ideology over traditional education, and that what parents believe that they are getting in terms of reading, writing, arithmetic, kind of basic, American values, not partisan values, those are being increasingly subserviated to an ideology that basically every single teacher who goes into the classroom is steeped in before they get to class.
Identity is another component of SEL. Kids are taught to see themselves as part of a group, not as individuals. Things like skin color and sexual orientation are a couple of the determiners in deciding which group a kid belongs to.
No, we need to decolonize and disrupt whiteness. It pervades everything that we do, how we start a meeting, even agenda items.
SEL programs operate from the perspective that every kid needs help dealing with emotional or behavioral issues, whether they do or not.
The other thing to mention about these social emotional learning programs is they operate from this perspective that every student, not just some students that may need some special help with behavioral or emotional issues, every student they treat as somebody who needs a psychological intervention.
And kids who can't relate to trauma are placed in the group with the adults. They become part of the oppressors.
Nobody wants to feel that way. It is uncomfortable to think that you are oppressing somebody else unknowingly. And so then you see this sort of desperate need for kids to feel like they want to escape that category. And so they want to identify in some other way that will get them out of that oppressor status into the oppressed, because they see that any of their peers who are being categorized as somebody who's oppressed, they get treated differently. And unfortunately, they often receive more praise. They get more leniency and latitude and understanding and celebration. And what student doesn't want that, And so I think that they are looking for avenues, again, out of their oppressor status. And it is how you align and what your identity is.
Kids look for a way to win approval and fit in.
You see that there are now more students than ever that are identifying as something other than a heterosexual human. And so I think that doesn't seem natural to me. Transgender, bisexual, all of these other, categories now that they have to articulate what your gender identity is that authentic? Is that authentic? I mean, really, has that always been the case and now they're just feeling that it is safe to come out with that? Or is there something else going on here where you've told these students that there is like this inescapable, identity as an oppressor, and the only possible way that you wouldn't be is if you are one of these other identity groups? Kids are looking for the exit ramp, and I think if they can find it in identifying in some sort of, more nebulous. And again, I think a lot of these gender identities are somewhat ambiguous even to, adults that are looking at this. And it's like, what does that actually mean? And what does it mean when you're a third grader? You are not a sexual being really at that point in that way. And so I think that, it's incredibly confusing to these kids. And when they get love bombed sort of from their teachers and their peers for being courageous and brave to, choose one of these other identities to align with, they're going to crave that more and more. And unfortunately, because I feel like we are not now in a merit-based system in our schools where they're getting recognized as they have in the past for academic achievement and, other markers of, working hard and that merit-based recognition is gone, kids want to be praised for something. They want to be validated. And so it's like, if this is the way that they can get that, they're going to do it. And who can blame them? Children want that. They crave it. And so again, it's really preying on, I think, a really vulnerable psyche of young people.
The reality is, these programs are the delivery mechanisms for highly politicized ideologies, and most parents don't realize it. Can you give me an example of what that would look like in a lesson?
Yes, they are looking for inroads, using just your everyday math and reading curriculum. What is the inroad? What is the conversation starter that we can have with these young children to talk about social issues? And so sometimes what that looks like is during a math lesson, you might have a story problem about somebody going to an amusement park or something, and the teacher starts asking probing questions. And she's trying to find the kid that's going to say, well, this kid can't go to the amusement park because maybe his parents can't afford it, or we don't have a car, or, a variety of different things. That's their conversation starter to then start pulling out, well, why is that? And, what could be different about this situation? How can we make this a more equitable situation? And so now you've moved from a math problem to a social conversation about, redistribution of wealth.
Hasn't social emotional learning always been a part of education? According to Lynn, it has. She has taught in several schools in the metro. But she said SEL has been redefined and not for the better.
We've always taught kids, well, this is what you do to be a good citizen. These are the people in your community. This is how you are helpful to the people in your community. So that's always been part of it, but not to the point where you are contradicting parent values. And that's where I think people have crossed a line. And really, our job is to teach kids how to read and write and how to be successful out in the world. And some of that is social emotional learning, but not to the point where you tell a child that their family is wrong for believing something because this is what we believe. That's not what we should be doing anymore.
Then I also started to see just didn't seem like things that used to be taught were being taught. Didn't seem like anybody really was pushing for quality work to be done.
Alfreda Baldwin is a retired attorney and founder of Laurel Community School, a K-8 private school in the Twin Cities.
I retired on a Friday, and on a Tuesday the following week, I was volunteering in my local school district. And it took just a few weeks to realize something was very different than my memory of my own education and even of my children's education. And something just felt really wrong and off.
Alfreda said it initially had to do with discipline or lack thereof. As she spent more time in schools, she noticed things that used to be taught were no longer being taught, and the quality of a kid's work no longer mattered.
These assignments they're giving kids are just junk. They're not teaching kids how to print. They're not teaching kids how to write cursive. There's something wrong with the reading instruction. Math instruction being just not designed to teach kids really how to do math.
She noticed kids didn't seem to know the basics.
I remember the kids working on a kind of a reading comprehension assignment, and they had to read a passage, and it was about new coins that were being minted with the presidents on them.
They were supposed to identify the main idea or topic of a paragraph.
It was right there in the title, and these kids just couldn't figure it out. And then there were questions about different presidents, and they didn't know who these presidents were. And I realized it seemed like education used to have this build-up, this foundation. So you'd start learning something, and then you'd build on that, and then you'd build on that. And it became clear to me that these kids had no foundation.
She discovered knowledge-based education had been abandoned. kids in the 4th grade classroom didn't know basic historical facts.
I had one kid who didn't know what Independence Day was. That was another thing. They were not this notion of spelling. It was like sound it out and spell it the way it sounds. I had kids who could not spell states. And then I had teachers saying, well, they don't let us teach cursive anymore, or they aren't going to let us teach print anymore, or teachers saying we can't do timetable memorization anymore. So there's always a debate about what's the best way to teach, what should you teach. But it just seems like some things have been tried and true, and those things were being eliminated.
Baldwin said there was little motivation for students to learn facts. Who needs an encyclopedia when you have Google or Siri?
So the idea was that no one needs to know this stuff anymore because we're going to use devices. That was one of the biggest battles I had with kids. We'd be reading and they'd come upon a word that they didn't understand, and I'd say, okay, what does this word mean? And that was one of the things that struck me. I had a group of kids who were really good readers. We'd be really reading some really interesting stories, and they'd come to a word and they couldn't pronounce it because they hadn't been taught how to sound out words. And so then I'd say, let's go to the dictionary. And I would always get, why do we need to use a dictionary? Why can't we ask Siri? And I was like, okay, what if you don't have access to Siri? What if the power is out in your phone or your computer is out of power? You need to know how to do this the old-fashioned way. And it's fine to use Siri, but you need to know how to do it without Siri.
What did you discover about how all this started, how we got to where we are today?
Well, I'm going to preface my remarks by saying when I first went down this rabbit hole, I would read stuff and I would think, oh, some crazy person has written this. This is some tinfoil nut. But over time, I began to see that they weren't crazy, and a lot of the stuff that people had been concerned about was not only here, but expanding.
Baldwin discovered a man named John Dewey, who some consider the father of American education. Rather than approach education as a means to prepare young people for life, Dewey viewed it as a means to motivate and empower them to transform society. Dewey closely identified with Karl Marx and progressives who embraced socialism.
He started teachers' colleges, and that changed the way teachers taught and what they taught. He, from what I understand, gave us this flawed reading, whole language versus phonics.
Dewey was opposed to teaching content through rote memorization. He advocated an approach to education where kids would construct their own knowledge based on their own experiences.
Rote memorization, just the way kids had been educated in the past, he just was not a fan of. And some people say that his method of education was really intended to dumb people down because it wasn't about transmitting knowledge. It was about something else.
What was the impact?
So it's interesting because all of this stuff seems to have been happening around the same time. Karl Marx came along with his worldview and obviously had a lot of appeal to progressives. Karl Marx wanted to just overthrow society as it existed at the time. Dewey was so enamored of this, and so he transformed the way teachers were taught and what was going to be taught. It was with the aim of bringing about this change that really is rooted in Marxism. It has nothing to do with educating children. It has to do with indoctrinating. If you ask me, it's about control.
James Lindsay wrote a book called The Marxification of Education, Paulo Freire's Critical Marxism and the Theft of Education. According to Lindsay, Freire is easily the most influential name in education in the 20th century, but most people don't even know who he is or how his theory of education is affecting kids. This is from Lindsay's podcast, New Discourses.
The big kind of punchline of the book, repeatedly stated, and often in italics, is our kids go to Paulo Freire schools. The argument that I'm making in general is everything that you're seeing with the brainwashing, the Maoist-style thought reform through social emotional learning, whether it's critical consciousness raising, whether it's culturally responsive or culturally relevant education.
Freire's theory is embedded in curriculum in teachers' colleges all over North America. Lindsay said the adoption of his theories should be considered one of the greatest education scandals in the history of the world.
Whether even it's rooted into the comprehensive sexuality education, all of the stuff where we're seeing that children are learning to become activists for Marxist left-wing causes, that they're being trained through a so-called equity lens, and that they are failing to learn math, reading, writing, science, history, social studies, etc., in an adequate way. All of that can be explained by that simple sentence: our kids go to Paulo Freire's schools.
Like Dewey, Freire believed education should be transformed from objectivity, such as phonics instruction, to subjectivity, whole language reading. Instead of sounding out words, kids guess at what a word means based on pictures and other words on the page.
I'm just a person that lived in Brazil for 47 years, and then we start seeing things growing more towards socialism. To be honest, they don't motivate you to learn much about Marxism, because they know if you start reading, you're going to make comparisons.
Lucia is now an American citizen. Based on what she knows about Freire, she's concerned for kids in America. Educators are teaching the principles of communism and Marxism without ever using the words, and parents don't know.
He said, dominate the schools, dominate the cultural life in universities, and you are going to have a new generation ready to apply the communism in the country. You know that tale about the frog in boiled water that first you put in it's not boiled, it's not boiling, and then the frog doesn't feel anything. And that's what our society has been doing, with the kids, with us.
Dewey called that incrementalism.
Dewey had said on day one, I want to basically get your kids to give up family, give up God, give up support for democracy and capitalism. Nobody would have gone along with that. So instead of showing all your cards, it was just this slow takeover. And a lot of it has to do with dumbing people down. And so we don't teach people to read well. We don't teach people to write well. We don't teach people to use critical thinking. And eventually we can make them vulnerable to having their minds filled with stuff that will bring about the world we want. And so, again, it's just change what's taught, what's in the curriculum. I mean, it's being removed under the guise of, well, it's just a bunch of dead white men. It's racist.
How is this affecting education?
That's the $1 million question, to be honest. I've been reading about this stuff now, really coming from scratch 2 years ago, but reading about it in heavy detail. And I still, to this day, when I have to say it out loud, I struggle to connect those dots.
Steve is a medical professional whose kids attended Sartell schools.
But what you start to see when you're looking at this stuff and reading the original sources on where this stuff originates is you see that this has now overtaken really every aspect, certainly at the university level. And now we're seeing it, I think, in really significant ways in the last 5 to 10 years, impacting K-12 education. It's using these different identity groups to start to raise this consciousness of oppression. And again, I don't think that they even realize that they're doing this, most people. It's just what's happening. And it is a struggle to try to get more people to understand it, because it's not a simple concept to understand.
Freire said, teach the political point first.
And trust that they're going to learn everything else in the process. And you see scores dropping across the country, really, as they're adopting these methods, as they're going more this direction with education. You're seeing scores plummet, and that shouldn't be a surprise.
Here's what Freire's theory looks like in practice. First, capture the colleges of education. Then, mold a generation of teachers who will program every generation of students thereafter.
That's exactly what's going on inside of teacher colleges and colleges of education.
Laura is a recent graduate of Minnesota State University, Mankato.
They're definitely pushing that kind of belief onto the students that are trying to become teachers. And I would say based off of the commentary and the discussions placed inside of the classroom that I was in with my cohort, I would say it's definitely working. There's a lot of students in my cohort that I would almost be fearful if my own kids had them as a teacher.
Laura said students are learning to identify with the oppressed.
The students in the cohort where they would talk about, Black Lives Matter, or they'd talk about Native Americans and things like that. They believe that a lot of the things that were issues however many 100 years ago were still like big issues that are still prevalent today. So a lot of those issues that have been solved in one way or another or are being worked towards being solved, to them, they think it's still a massive problem. And you can see like the anger in their hearts about that. It's not really like said like you should be angry. They never really said that outwardly, but you can almost more sense it and feel it versus it being spoken.
Laura said the words communism, socialism, or Marxism were never used in the classroom.
They did say that capitalism needs to change in order to help everyone, basically. There was one student who I still get shocked by this because I think it's so crazy. But there's one student who said, I don't understand the discussion on capitalism and socialism and communism. They're basically all the same thing anyway, so just pick one and be done with it, which I found so shocking.
Too many Minnesota kids are graduating from high school and can't sign their names in cursive, calculate a tip at a restaurant without a smartphone, or understand that Americans have the right to freely speak their minds. Education is failing. Record numbers of freshmen are taking remedial classes just to get into college. Proficiency scores in math and reading are the lowest they've been in 30 years. Most teachers think they're educating kids, but declining test scores tell a different story. Standardized test scores like the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment indicate kids are learning less and less. We have 47 million public school students in America. So what does our society look like when we train them all in social emotional learning and then we deploy them out into our society?
Yeah, well, if everybody takes a minute to think about that, I think we can all arrive at the conclusion that, we're driving these young people. I mean, when they come out of K through 12, then they're an adult. They're a voter, and they're able to make their own decisions. And I think that, they then have experienced many years in this system. They're ready to be launched out into the world to be these disruptors. They're there to dismantle the system, and that's what they've been trained to do for years. And so I think we can't help but to expect. I mean, the expectation then is that they're going to go out and do exactly what these programs have suggested is their social responsibility. And I think, often social emotional learning, they use these, terms like self-management or making responsible decisions. And they define it as a responsible decision is, voting in a particular way, voting for initiatives that will be equitable or, good for the environment or whatever it might be. And yes, that's true. I think we should all vote in that way. But I also think that it has them set aside what's good for them for what is good for, the collective good. And I don't think that that's a really healthy place for people to be making decisions either. So,
well, what can parents do?
What can parents do? The number one thing I think we have to do is they have to understand what this is.
Like mimes, educators are communicating their message and masking it from parents. But kids are getting the message loud and clear.
But you have a lot of kids who think communism is good. I mean, it does sound good on paper. If you just read about it, it sounds lovely, doesn't it? But if you actually look at the countries that are communist countries, their people aren't happy. It's not good in practice. Yeah. And if we don't go deeper with our students and say this is what communism is, sounds great. Well, but let's give an example. And how's that working for that country?
Parents, not educators, should decide which values will prevail and what's best for kids.
Is I would say that it's going to require probably some hands-on work to understand what is going on in the schools truly, and to understand probably the dangers that it poses to certainly our kids, but really to, I would say, our nation as a whole. The beliefs that we are instilling in the kids, and I wouldn't even say we're instilling, we're just conditioning them. This is the lens through which they view things. These are concepts and principles that have not done well worldwide through history. These have led to major issues and, quite frankly, a lot of destruction. It's the opposite belief of what the United States was founded to be, the idea that we have freedoms.
My name is Sheila Qualls, and you are listening to Trapped, Chaos in the Classroom. Listen to episode 5 as we discuss ways to advocate for your kids in public schools and also look at alternatives.
What if teachers just started secretly baptizing kids at school and hid it from their parents?
If you know of chaos in a classroom, email me at sheila@alphanews.org or email tips@alphanews.org. Trapped is a podcast from Alpha News. It's reported by me and produced by Kendall Johnson of Underdog Films. Editing by Karen Sullivan. Fact-checking by Anthony Gokowski and Greg Pullis. Our theme music is by Kendall Johnson. We have one more episode coming. You'll be able to find all episodes on our website. Subscribe at mntrapped.com. This podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. This episode contains profanity. Public education in Minnesota is in crisis.
St. Paul is in shock tonight after a student was killed in a stabbing at Harding High School.
They just kept on beating him and pounding his head up against the desk.
Why did the colonists fight the Revolutionary War?
No clue.
Who is the father of our country?
I have no idea.
I'm in 5th grade, and there's a lot of girls in our class that are bisexual and that are dating.
Cheyenne came home one day and told me, Mom, there's going to be a class on sexting.
Only one viewpoint is acceptable, and it's downloaded into kids at school every day.
For example, I had a kid tell me to go get fucked.
As a parent in this world today, you do not want to be the one saying, hey, I don't think you're disciplining the children of color. That will automatically make you seem like a racist, prejudiced person.
There is vandalism at Farmington High School. The bathrooms are not a place that these kids can go.
Discipline has changed. Parents don't know this.
But the reality is, from a safety perspective, they just have to know that these kids are, generally speaking, not being dealt with. I mean, there are a lot of dangerous kids in these schools.
Put up the Ku Klux Klan mask, and first day of school, first meeting, and all the white people had to remain quiet for 15 minutes to absorb the guilt of what the Ku Klux Klan did.
Would never have my child in a public elementary school, and I hate to say that. That grieves my heart tremendously.
We started this podcast to give parents a look inside public education. We've told you what's happening. In this episode, we're going to tell you ways you can advocate for your kids.
I sent him to school where I thought he was safe. It hurts.
If you decide public school is not a good fit for your kids, I'll talk about alternatives as well.
It's like I'm trapped, like everything's trapped inside me because I can't talk about it.
I'm Sheila Qualls. I write for a Minnesota-based news outlet called Alpha News. I've written a series of articles on ideologies, policies, and practices that allow violence, misconduct, and low performance to go unchecked. For the past 6 months, we've been examining public education. I've interviewed teachers, parents, and students. I've talked to people who study education in Minnesota. I've looked at curriculum and school websites. I've contacted the Department of Education, the Minnesota School Board Association, the teachers union, and administrators. I'm going to paint a picture of what is going on in our schools and why. Not in my words, but in the words of teachers, students, and parents who are in or around public schools every day. Thousands of Minnesota families are trapped, held hostage by a system that is shaped by misguided and irresponsible policies and practices that are at odds with traditional values. The threat of losing our children is real. Most teachers and parents spoke with us on the promise of anonymity. Small details have been changed to protect students' identities. They fear retaliation. Dissent is not tolerated. Disagreement is voiced only in whispers. Throughout this series, I'm going to show you everything from why kids can't read to why they have to worry about getting stabbed at school. This is episode 5 of Trapped: Chaos in the Classroom.
What if teachers just started secretly baptizing kids at school and hid it from their parents? What would the reaction be? That's different, right?
I found this video on Jacqueline Sassy's Instagram account. Teachers aren't baptizing kids, but ideology has become like a religion to educators. That religion is social emotional learning, and it's in conflict with traditional values. The reality is, these programs are the delivery mechanism for highly politicized ideologies. While social emotional learning deceives parents, it conditions kids to be disruptors. They no longer work on developing critical thinking skills. Instead, kids learn to focus on feelings with the goal of changing social outcomes. With plummeting test scores, shouldn't administrators be focused on improving academic outcomes, not social ones? Teachers who don't agree are silenced by the fear of losing their jobs. Administrators weaponize labels like homophobic and racist against parents because they have no evidence social emotional learning works. What if parents realized personal attacks are the only ammunition administrators have to defend their agenda? And what if they stopped allowing those labels to paralyze them and allowed them to motivate them instead? Based on their own experiences, parents think they know what's going on in schools. But do they really?
I think parents probably just need to not assume they know what's going on in schools. It's probably different from when they were in school.
Centennial parents discovered the district was promoting an organization that helps girls acquire free chest binders. St. Paul Public Schools partnered with AmazeWorks, which delivers an LGBTQ agenda under the guise of anti-bias or anti-bullying education. Parents have unearthed books containing sexually graphic content in schools.
Parent Michelle Brown discovered a sexually graphic book was being made available to students.
This parent is not from Minnesota, but similar books have been found in Minnesota high school libraries across the state.
She confronted the local school board, and its response ended up proving her point.
Here's an excerpt, and I'm going to really try to be careful so I don't get kicked out. Excited now, he pushed into her. As she squeezed her eyes and tightly as she could, her tongue circled her lips. He pushed harder, his breath heavy and labored. She scratched his back, and he cried out. She bit his ear and pulled his hair. There's a lot more to it. It's 50 Shades of Grey and CCSD.
Excuse me.
Yes.
We have children at home.
I
It's live
understand.
streaming, and it's really not appropriate.
Don't you
for to
find
read
the
that.
irony in that? You're exactly saying exactly what I'm telling you.
Elementary schools host gender resource fairs, which often feature drag queen story hours. Districts are adding ethnic studies programs, which teach kids about white supremacy and oppression. And an Arden Hills elementary school teacher bragged on her TikTok that her goal is for students not to be able to figure out if she's a boy or a girl.
One of my coworkers told me that they were talking to some students in the hallway, and the students asked the other teacher if I'm a boy or a girl. And the teacher was like, does it matter? You know, she's cool. And they were like, no, I just can't figure it out. It's just so hard, I can't figure it out. It's just like, that's the goal. That's the goal.
Some teachers admit to shutting their doors when they teach the U.S. Constitution in a traditional manner. They fear offending someone.
Shut the door, sometimes just because I'm it's just not worth of what other teachers are going to be thinking, because they think I don't know, it's just crazy. But I did find out my principal and I came out to each other. He's conservative too.
I began this series by telling you education in Minnesota is broken. Violence and low academic performance are plaguing public schools. Student safety and learning are being sacrificed on the altar of ideology. Think it's not happening in your kid's school? This is Matt Audette. He's a school board member in Anoka-Hennepin, Minnesota's largest school district.
What I would say to a parent who says, it's not happening in my school district, I would say you might want to examine very closely. And, I'm hoping through part of what we do, we can help people to see it, identify where these issues are. Because I will tell you from my own experience, schools are reluctant to come out and say exactly what's happening, especially to use the kinds of terms that people would generally use to identify these things.
I am the product of public schools. One of my kids attended public schools, but public schools aren't functioning as they used to. They've blurred the lines between teacher and parent, and schools lack accountability. In the first 4 episodes, I offered examples of the chaos in our schools, but I also promised I'd offer solutions. If kids aren't safe in public schools, if they aren't learning what they need to know to be successful in life, what are the options?
I would just encourage parents to get involved and become much more vocal. So many great parents are doing what they can do every day to, get to work, get their bills paid, make sure their children have what they need, send them to school, clothed and with a good meal, encourage them to do their homework when they come home, and trust that the teachers and the administrators are going to do right and give them the best education they can. But all of this influx of political, social ideology into the schools has become such a distraction to the true job of an educational institution. And parents need to understand that if they don't push back and say, we just want education, we don't want you to tell our student how to think, how to feel, how to respond. We want them to know their reading and the writing and math and history and all the core subjects.
I'm not anti-public school teacher, or homophobic, and I don't suffer from internalized racism. I'm pro-kid, pro-parent, and pro-family. Parents should decide what is best for their kids. To do that, they need to be informed and realize these issues are not confined to inner-city schools or bad neighborhoods.
I'm an educator and I work in District 196.
This is Karen. Karen called me because she wanted to tell her story. She said teachers are conflicted. They're terrified of losing their jobs, but feel compelled to speak up because kids aren't safe.
So our school is nestled in a very wealthy area of Eagan. It's in a beautiful, beautiful area of Eagan, surrounded by beautiful homes. You would think with some of the behaviors and things that are going on that we were downtown Minneapolis, with the things that we see on a daily basis in our classrooms and in our hallways.
Kids are frequently found wandering in the parking lot. They're exposed to violence, low academic expectations, and social justice indoctrination. Districts use iPads and Chromebooks so kids have access to pornography online. This is happening in a suburban school, in a nice neighborhood.
We've just had so many issues, and it all stems down to the fact that the behaviors are so out of control that all of the support people in the building are being pulled for behaviors and aren't able to maintain supervision, aren't able to maintain adequate IEP terms and conditions.
She said 60% of the teachers in her school quit last year, including all but one kindergarten teacher. Karen said kids punch, kick, and spit on teachers on a daily basis. Karen's story is not unusual. We've heard stories from every type of district: large, small, metro, suburban, and greater Minnesota. And they all illustrate how a system that used to be considered one of the best is falling apart. Families all over the state find themselves in the horns of dilemma, asking themselves, is public school the best place for my kids? Many educators aren't focused on the 3 R's. They're not helping kids to become contributing members of society. Instead, they are laser focused on pushing ideology to change culture. Do they want a population that is semi-literate and easily controlled? Why would educators teach kids the sins of the country without teaching about its virtues?
I think we're battling ideology. I think we're battling philosophy, and parents should be evaluating education is what is the philosophy they want their children to learn, because really philosophy is everything.
Public schools in Minnesota operate as autonomous zones. Administrators believe they are accountable to no one. They intimidate teachers into silence. They trample parental rights. They place restraining orders on parents, preventing them from talking to teachers or other parents. They change students' names and pronouns even when parents object. They may think they answer to no one, but actually they do. They answer to you, parents. You can hold them accountable because you decide where your kids will get their education. Minnesota isn't a school choice state, but parents have a range of options, including open enrollment. Open enrollment allows parents to enroll kids outside of their district if they aren't happy with their local schools. Other options are private, parochial, charter, and homeschooling.
I think that's why a number, family members are choosing homeschooling, because they're like, we don't want to, it's the work to understand what's happening in the schools, or whatever, or trying to find different options for education. I understand it.
More and more families are exercising their options. According to Minnesota Department of Education, public school enrollment has declined for 3 years in a row, but private and charter school enrollment continues to climb. School funding is directly tied to enrollment in Minnesota. Even a small drop in enrollment can cause major money problems for school districts.
I know a lot of parents whose kids are still in public school.
Tiffany Taylor pulled her son Brad from District 196. That's the district she attended and graduated from. They shared their story in episode 3.
And they know it's bad, and they know they're concerned, and they don't feel peace, but they feel like it's too hard to move them because their kids have friends and it's an adjustment and the sports. But like the peace I feel, I'm gonna start crying. The peace I feel that he goes to school and I know what he's learning is truth just supersedes any of that.
Tiffany offered advice for parents making tough decisions.
And when I think of those things, I kind of laugh, like the things I thought were important are not important when it comes to your child. Like your child is so important, and getting them raised in the right way and learning the right things is the most important thing you'll ever do as a parent. The school is with your child sometimes more than you are. And even if you think your child's really strong, they're children. They shouldn't have to go and be warriors against this kind of stuff. And when they're hearing it every single day, it's really hard for it not to take root in their brain. And their heart. And so I would just encourage parents, yes, it's scary. It's hard to take that leap and make that change, but it's worth it. And your kids are stronger than you know.
Alan Hodak is an administrator at Fourth Baptist Christian School in Plymouth. He said they have increased their enrollment by over 100 kids each year for 2 consecutive years. He said parents are not happy with what their kids are learning in public school.
Well, I think a lot of it is they're just realizing they're not being taught the things that they were taught. And so the traditional form of education where mathematics and grammar and spelling and history and all of the things that we went through as kids in school, they're listening to what they're being taught, and it's just not happening anymore. And so I think they're realizing their kids have holes, they're realizing their kids are falling behind, and they don't want that to happen. So they're reaching out and they're going to other places, and they're seeing what's out there, what's available, and they're trying to pick and choose schools and programs that more align with their worldview and what they actually believe and what they want for their children.
Kids who were AB students in districts struggle when they transfer to Fourth Baptist.
I think of one young lady who came in as a freshman this year, and she had all A's and B's, and she had pretty much the normal classes titles that we would be giving our kids at 9th grade and 10th grade. And so she came in, and she had A's and B's, but in our program she could barely get through. And she was behind. And she was behind in reading, she was behind in grammar and writing and math, and yet she had A's and B's in the district she was going through.
He said they do a lot of work to help kids catch up.
This is something we've had to really evaluate as a school, is how do we catch kids up in areas like mathematics where they are behind a grade level or two. And we're getting, especially at the older grades, a lot of children who are they're just behind. They cannot do the math that we are teaching our students in our system. So when I say our system, I'm speaking of our private school system. And so if they're coming in at a certain grade level and they have not learned some of the foundational things they need to learn in math, then there are many, many holes, and they cannot do our math. And so we are having to find out ways to just reteach.
He said when looking at schools, parents need to decide what they want their kids to learn. He said kids shouldn't be indoctrinated in philosophies that parents don't agree with.
I don't want my kids indoctrinated in a philosophy that my wife and I don't believe in. That's our responsibility as parents. And I feel like that's being taken away in our culture, where an ideology of philosophy, some of the things you mentioned earlier, are really being hammered into our kids.
Private schools are an option, but they aren't always immune from the ideology. Gender and race ideologies are popping up in some private schools, too. State Senator Nathan Wiesenberg and his wife Jenny live in Little Falls. They said just because your kid attends a private school doesn't mean all is well. Their kids attend a parochial school.
We have 3 girls, and they go to Mary of Lourdes Catholic School in Little Falls, and they're in 5th, 3rd, and 1st grade right now.
They're happy with the teachers, but just like many public school families, they're having problems with the administration.
This school wanted to bring in an outside theater troupe, the Climb Theater, to come in and teach the kids about anti-bullying. Great. Let's teach the kids not to bully. I think that's absolutely appropriate. However, being the diligent parents that we are, there was a number of us that got together and looked at their website, their Facebook page, and our eyebrows raised a little because of some of the things that we saw on there.
Right.
She discovered anti-bullying is used to mask teaching gender ideology. When they objected, they got a letter from Father Ben and Jody Vander Hayden, the principal.
The mission of Mary Lourdes School is to be Christ-centered and dedicated to excellence in education by developing the whole person, integrating our Catholic faith with daily life. This is the mission that we are entrusted and charged with. Under the guidance of Bishop Donald Kettler, our diocese provides us with support, resources, and direction to help the school to live its Catholic ministry. We value and need parents to partner with us, and Mary of Lourdes School holds to that expectation. We are not a provider of personal services where parents make demands or pick and choose what they feel is appropriate. It is an expectation that our efforts as school leaders are made with good intentions, in good faith, and are well informed. The 2022 parental enrollment agreement must be respected, and if it can't be, then one is encouraged to seek an alternative option or environment for your children. So after we had shown them this Climb Theater, they basically said, well, if you don't like it, you can leave.
The couple decided to share information about Climb with other parents.
That was on a Saturday at like 6 p.m. and by about 8:30 that night, the principal and priest were like, oh crap, we have to not let this theater group come.
They got an email from the principal the next day.
She sent out an email, oh, we didn't know any of this was happening. They won't be coming here. This was just brought to our attention. No, we brought it to your attention 3 weeks ago. And you said, we don't care. And it wasn't until it became more broad that they stopped. And what we were trying to do is show them so we didn't have to do that, because that's what they wanted. Communicate, and then they would have said, oh, you're right, but they don't care.
Senator Wiesenberg said parents and teachers need to start speaking up and administrators need to start listening.
We're sort of in this little bubble, and we're not welcoming outside opinions. We say that we welcome diversity of thought, but we really don't. We really don't, because if somebody disagrees, or if you have somebody, say I'm one of those teachers who is pushing one of those agendas, and I have a conservative parent that comes in, well, that parent is just shut down and ostracized.
Not every parent can or will pull their kids from public schools. Katrin Wigfall is a fellow at the Center for the American Experiment and a former teacher. She views the problems with education as both a parent and a professional.
Taught at a public school, but I think it's also important to make options for families as we work to fix a system that's very broken and has been for decades.
Christine Troyan is a parent of elementary-aged kids. She was unhappy with what her kids were learning in their West Metro School District, so she pulled them and now she homeschools them. But she didn't stop there. She formed Minnesota Parents Alliance, a nonpartisan advocacy group.
You know, the most important thing that parents can do is know exactly what this is, review the curriculum, develop a relationship with your student's teacher, figure out if they're the teacher or if they're the activist, figure out what your child's hearing, ask them a million questions, have those conversations with your kids because it's really important.
And she also said, get involved. Volunteer in your kid's classroom. Get a better feel for the culture of your kid's school. What kind of posters and flags are displayed? Do they have a policy about pronouns and gender? And check the school library.
Look into volunteering in your student's school library to see what books are on the shelves. So there are a lot of ways that parents can get involved at the local grassroots level.
Alfreda Baldwin is a retired corporate attorney. She started a private school. She encourages parents to look for clues about how their kids' district and school operate.
Well, so here's one thing I encourage parents to do. Go out to your school's websites and or the school you're thinking of sending your child to and just dig. I mean, if you have any concerns about any of this stuff, just try to go and dig, and you might have to use the search function on the website and just search for equity, search for gender, so that you can see whether or not your school district has any policies, made any statements about any of this stuff. And then if you find stuff, you have to evaluate whether it matches your family's values.
They make it hard to find.
They make it hard to find.
Understand the difference between a practice and a policy. Your kid's school may not have a written policy that allows transgender kids to socially transition at school without parents' knowledge, but they may have an unwritten practice of doing so. Social emotional learning, culturally responsive teaching, anti-bullying, anti-bias education all sound good. But what do these concepts mean in practice?
And I remember being at this meeting, and they said that whole, all of the teaching around bullying was really being driven at the top by the gay, lesbian, the LGBTQ. That was the driving force behind it.
Beth teaches in a metro school. She found out the hard way.
And I remember, I heard what they were saying, but I struggled. You couldn't imagine that would be then used, because who's not against bullying, but that it would really attack them. It's really ideology. If you simply hold to a differing viewpoint, now it's become, you're hateful. People don't feel safe. You're a threat. Because I happen to think differently.
You have a right to be in your kid's classroom and know what's being taught. So spend time in your kid's classroom when you can and talk to your kid.
Ask questions of their kids. yes, with everything on the iPad, asked to see it. But I do think the encouragement is to start those relationships young where there's a conversation, so that you have that relationship with your kids.
Opt your kids out of any material that isn't consistent with your family's values.
If I had to do it again, I would be a lot more proactive in understanding what was going on. And again, that first realization came primarily as a parent when I found out what had been presented to one of my children in a health class, and I wasn't aware of it and hadn't been given the opportunity to opt out of it. And what was presented was diametrically opposed to everything that I was seeking to teach in the home. So that was the first eye-opener to me.
And most importantly, request to review curriculum.
The number one thing I think we have to do is they have to understand what this is. And I think that's a big piece of what we're talking about here, is really truly understand when they're using terms social emotional learning. What does that mean? And the first way that you can figure that out is by requesting curriculum. Request the curriculum. Find out what the social emotional learning program is in your district and ask for that material and look it over carefully. Go to the program's website. Do as much research as you can. And I know this takes time and parents are spread thin. It is an onerous process, but it is worth it, because I think that what is, more time consuming is to have, young adults going out into the world who are completely not able to be critical thinkers and independent humans.
Attend school board meetings. You may be able to find out policies your board is considering. Speaking up at school board meetings doesn't always mean you'll see change.
We've seen examples where it did. I think nationally, I have seen examples where it did. I've certainly seen examples in my own district where it does not. And as a person who sits on the board, I can see and understand that. I have not yet seen an interaction at a school board meeting where, as a result of the parents being there, something specific changed. That it certainly didn't change that day.
Audette said, the only way you will bring about change is to change the board. You can run for school board or support candidates who better reflect your values.
Never felt motivated myself to get involved in anything, but I guess when it started to impact my children, which was, like any parent, that was something that I just couldn't take. And that's what led me into it ultimately, is deciding to do it. And then as I started considering it, that's just like every parent. It's like the story you hear from every parent or of everybody about this. As parents, myself included, started to look into what was happening in their schools. We found things that we weren't aware of that were happening that we also didn't like. Things, a lot of people call it CRT, and some of these things, the schools call it equity. And then some of these other practices that are kind of connected to that are having an impact on a lot of different things in the environment of schools. And so that's probably what, was the final thing that kept me deciding to stay with the election or campaign to be elected.
School board races are supposed to be nonpartisan, but Education Minnesota, the state's teachers union, has money, influence, and an agenda. They work to get their preferred candidates on school boards around the state.
So let me just say, first of all, I see, online people post and read articles and everything that, the teachers union's not for the students. Well, they really aren't.
Lynn has taught in metro schools for 25 years.
I mean, let's be honest about the fact that the job of the union is to negotiate the teacher's contract and make sure that they have a good health care plan and they have the support they need and make sure that good teachers are hired and retained. And by that, you're indirectly supporting the students. But their job is not to decide curriculum, and their job is not to make sure that certain programs get into the schools. That's the job of the school board and the superintendent. But I think that it's gotten out of control. Like I said, my experience in my 20s was, we're only supporting the Democratic ticket. Well, okay, first of all, that's a problem. Second of all, why are you supporting any ticket? Locally, I know that there are some school districts who they're not allowed, like the school boards aren't allowed to endorse a union candidate.
the union, is not allowed to endorse a school board candidate. And I think that's a good thing, because the number one job of a school board is to do what? Ratify the teacher contract, right? So right there, it's a big conflict of interest, I think. But more often than not, you have teachers' unions saying, this is the school board member that we're backing, and we're going to throw money and resources and door knockers and all kinds of things at this candidate. And not only do they do that, Minnesota Federation of Teachers goes to the local union meetings and says, these are the candidates we're endorsing, this is who you vote for, when that might not actually be the best candidate. So you have these school boards in some districts that are really bought and paid for by the union, and that's not the role of the union. They shouldn't have a direct voice in endorsing candidates.
She said unions have gotten too political.
And really, they're a political pack is what they are, and they're not shy about that. And so, like I said, while I was happy to have a union for some things, I was very fortunate, some of the benefits I got from that. I think that it's become a big political machine, and I think that we should have a rule in the whole entire state that says school board candidates should not be endorsed by unions, because they're basically seating people. And then when it comes time to ratify the teacher's contract or do other things negotiating with the union, then the union can say, we put you there. Remember that money we contributed to your campaign? Remember all that help we gave you? You owe us. So it's nice that there are some districts that don't allow that endorsement, but the majority do, unfortunately.
So what does the future look like for public schools?
Our schools are going to be in turmoil until such time as somebody either prevails, in which case, if one side prevails against the other side is going to do what you're seeing. They're going to pull out of the schools. If very many people pull out of the schools, it could lead to the collapse of our public school system. I don't think anybody thinks that's a good thing, but that's the only result. I mean, either people have to accept it, and there's a large portion of people who will not, or they're going to have to leave it. So if either side prevails, you're in that scenario. And so for the good of the system, if it's going to prevail, you got to get back to the way things always were. There's a reason people say schools aren't political and they shouldn't be political. Schools are political. There's a reason people think that they shouldn't. That's because the people that came before us knew and understood that. And they always had political differences, but they came together and they said, well, in our public schools, to be decent to all, we can't do that. That's been lost someplace, and that's why our schools are sick. And it won't change until we find that balance again, in my opinion.
Baldwin said, don't think your kids are safe just because you've pulled them out of public school. Everyone needs to be brave. Kids who attend public schools will impact every segment of society.
People have to be brave. This is no time to be afraid. If you care about kids, if you're a parent or a grandparent, aunt, uncle, just even a person with no kids but concerned about our country, you need to educate yourself, and then you need to be courageous.
Courage is contagious. This is not the time to sit on the sidelines. Your kids are counting on you.
There's an education omnibus bill that has the ethnic studies. It has removing all suspensions in there. It has removing testing from teachers, because they specifically said at the hearing that I was at that teachers of color can't pass the test, so we're going to get rid of the test because we want more teachers of color. The suspensions, they said the same thing. Kids of color get suspended more. We can't have suspension. Instead of looking at the reason, why can't the teachers pass the licensing test? Maybe it's because they never learned to read and write in Minnesota schools. Maybe that's why they can't pass the test. And now you want them to teach other people? No, maybe you should start teaching kids what they need to learn, and then they can pass the professional exam.
My name is Sheila Qualls, and you are listening to Trapped: Chaos in the Classroom. If you know of chaos in a classroom, email me at sheila@alphanews.org or email tips@alphanews.org. Trapped is a podcast from Alpha News. It's reported by me and produced by Kendall Johnson of Underdog Films. Editing by Karen Sullivan. Fact-checking by Anthony Gokowski and Greg Pullis. Our theme music is by Kendall Johnson. We hope you've enjoyed listening. You can find all 5 episodes on our website. This podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts.